The auctioneer hadn't even finished calling the opening bid when Harlan Pruitt shoved his way to the front of the crowd, grabbed the lead rope right out of Vivian Ashcroft's hands, and yanked the bay mare so hard the animal screamed and reared back on her hind legs. "You got nothing left to sell, girl," Harlan said, loud enough for every man in that yard to hear, his thumb hooked into his belt like he'd already won something. "Your daddy's debts don't die with him. That horse is collateral, and everybody here knows it." He didn't look at Vivian when he said it. He looked at the crowd, like she wasn't even there, like she was furniture someone had left out in the rain. If you've never watched a story like this one before, the kind that starts in dust and humiliation and ends somewhere you didn't expect, now is the time to subscribe to our channel and follow every chapter to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. The Carson Bluff Horse Auction ran every third Saturday of the month from April through October, and in all the years Vivian Ashcroft had attended it with her father, she had never once stood on the wrong side of the rope. She had always been a buyer's daughter. She knew how to read a horse's hocks before the auctioneer finished his pitch. She knew which animals were drugged to hide a limp, which ones had been starved down to look leaner, which sellers were honest, and which ones would smile at you and sell you a broken-down animal with 3 weeks left in its legs. Her father, Thomas Ashcroft, had taught her all of it before she was 14, walking her through every auction pen he'd ever stepped into, his hand resting on her shoulder like she was his apprentice, which she was. Thomas Ashcroft had been one of the most respected horse breeders in the Nevada Territory. People talked about his bloodlines the way other men talked about land, like it was something you worked your whole life to build and prayed your children would inherit. He hadn't been able to leave her any of it. The bank had moved faster than the grief. Within 6 weeks of her father's death, every account had been frozen, every pasture posted with foreclosure notices, every animal except one claimed against debts. Vivian hadn't known existed until the lawyers started arriving with their leather satchels and their careful, apologetic voices. Creditors she'd never heard of. Loans that didn't make sense. A paper trail her father had never mentioned, not once, in all the years she'd sat across the dinner table from him. She had fought it. She'd hired the only attorney in Reno who would take a partial payment, and he'd done his best, which turned out not to be enough. In the end, the law sided with the bank, the way the law usually did, and Vivian was left with $31, a change of clothes in a carpet bag, and Willow. Willow was a bay mare, 8 years old, with a white star between her eyes and a temperament so steady you could fire a rifle 10 feet from her ears and she wouldn't flinch. Thomas had bred her himself from a line he'd spent 15 years developing. She was the last of it. Every other animal from that bloodline had been auctioned off in a single morning while Vivian stood outside the barn and couldn't make herself watch. She had kept Willow because the bank's inventory list had a clerical error. The mare had been logged under a different name during the estate valuation, and by the time anyone noticed, Vivian was already gone with the horse, and the error was nobody's problem to chase. She wasn't proud of it, but she also wasn't sorry. Now she stood in the Carson Bluff auction yard with Willow's lead rope in her hand, and the mid-morning sun already hammering down on the back of her neck, and she was trying very hard not to look like a woman who had run out of options. She hadn't told anyone why she was there. She'd told herself she was just exploring what the market would offer, that she had choices, that she might decide Willow wasn't for sale after all, might turn around and walk back to the small room she was renting above the dry goods store in town, might find another way through. But she had $9 left. The 31 had gone to the attorney, to 2 weeks aboard for Willow at a stable outside town, to food, to the room. $9 and a horse she couldn't afford to keep and couldn't bear to part with. She was exploring nothing. She was selling her last thing. The auction yard was crowded for a Saturday. Word had gotten around that there'd be some quality animals coming through, and the buyers had turned out accordingly. Ranch hands, established cattlemen, a few horse traders from as far as Salt Lake, who sat up near the fence with their notebooks and their narrowed eyes. Vivian recognized some faces. A few of them recognized her. She could tell by the way they looked twice, then looked away, the way people did when they saw someone they'd known in better circumstances and didn't know what to say. She tied Willow to the post at the far end of the holding line and stood beside her. That was when Harlan Pruitt arrived. She'd known Harlan by reputation longer than she'd known him in person. He ran a mid-size operation about 12 miles north of where the Ashcroft Ranch had been, And he'd made several offers on her father's breeding stock over the years, none of which Thomas had accepted. Her father had said once quietly that Harlan Pruitt was the kind of man who treated animals the way he treated people, hard when he thought no one was watching and generous only when someone was. She hadn't asked him to explain further. She'd filed it away. Harlan was in his mid-50s, thick through the chest and shoulders, with a sun-cured face and small pale eyes that moved constantly, cataloging everything in a room before he'd decided what he wanted from it. He walked through the auction yard like a man who expected the crowd to part for him, and mostly it did because he had money, and money was its own kind of gravity in a place like this. He spotted Willow before he spotted Vivian. She watched him stop, tilt his head, cross his arms, study the mare the way a man studies something he's already decided to have. Then his eyes moved to Vivian and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, exactly. More like satisfaction. "Vivian Ashcroft," he said, walking over. He didn't ask how she was doing. He looked at the lead rope in her hand, at the mare, at the carpet bag sitting against the post. He cataloged all of it. "Didn't figure I'd see you out here." "I'm here every year," she said. "Not on this side of the rope, you weren't." She didn't answer that. Harlan moved past her and put his hand on Willow's neck, running his palm down toward the shoulder in the practiced motion of someone who'd handled thousands of horses. Willow tolerated it without enthusiasm, her ears tipped back slightly, her eye rolling just enough to track his movement. "This is the last of Thomas's breeding stock," Harlan said. Not a question. "She's for sale," Vivian said. "If the right offer comes in." Harlan smiled with his mouth. "You're not in a position to wait for the right offer, are you?" "I'm exactly in that position," she said. "Same as anyone else here." He looked at her for a moment, then back at the horse. "I'll give you $40, he said. Willow was worth $250 on a slow day and closer to $400 if the buyer understood what he was looking at. Vivian kept her face still. "No, thank you," she said. "50, Harlan said, like he was doing her a favor. "I'll wait for the auction." Harlan's smile thinned. He stepped a little closer, lowered his voice the way men did when they wanted to make sure a conversation stayed private. "Let me tell you how this is going to go," he said. "I've already spoken to most of the serious buyers here. Mention that the Ashcroft name comes with some complications right now. Legal questions, outstanding liens. Men don't like to buy into somebody else's trouble." Vivian went very still. "That's not true," she said carefully. "Doesn't have to be true," he said. "Just has to be believable." He shrugged, like he was helpless about the nature of rumors. "You'll be lucky to get $30 at auction, or you take my 50 now, before the bidding makes it worse." She looked at him for a long moment. Her father's voice, quiet and certain. Hard, when he thinks no one is watching. "I'll take my chances," she said. That was when Harlan took the rope. He didn't snatch it, exactly. It was more deliberate than that, more considered. He reached out and wrapped his hand around the lead rope just above hers and pulled, not violently, but with the absolute confidence of a man who had never had someone not let go. And when Vivian didn't let go, he pulled harder, and Willow jerked sideways against the pressure and let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream, but was close enough to one that the nearest buyers turned to look. "Get your hand off my horse," Vivian said. Her voice didn't shake. She was surprised it didn't shake. "Your daddy's debts don't die with him, girl," Harlan said, loud now, loud enough for the people who had turned to hear. "There's a lien on this animal, and everybody here ought to know it. You're selling something that's already promised to somebody else." It wasn't true. She knew it wasn't true. The estate had been settled, the debts cleared against the seized assets, and Willow was hers free and clear because of the inventory error. But she was standing in an auction yard with $9 in her pocket and no attorney beside her, and Harlan Pruitt was saying these things with the easy certainty of a man who'd learned that confidence was more persuasive than facts. She felt the crowd shift, felt the skepticism that was rising in it. The instinct people had to step back from a situation that might be complicated, that might bring problems they hadn't bargained for. She tightened her grip on the rope. "There is no lien," she said, loudly, clearly, looking at the crowd rather than at Harlan. "This horse was excluded from the estate valuation. She's mine. If anyone here wants to verify that, I have the documentation." She didn't have the documentation on her person. It was in a box in her rented room above the dry goods store, which was 3 miles away. She hoped nobody asked to see it right now. "She's lying," Harlan said, almost pleasantly. Or she's confused. Either way. He pulled the rope again. Sir. The voice came from somewhere to Vivian's left, calm and unhurried. Let go of the rope. Harlan turned. Vivian turned. The man who had spoken was standing about 8 feet away, hands in the pockets of a worn canvas work jacket, watching the situation with an expression that was difficult to read. Not angry, not alarmed, just focused in a way that was somehow more unsettling than either. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, with a lean, weathered face and dark eyes that had settled on Harlan with the kind of unhurried attention that men gave things they had already decided about. Vivian knew who he was. Most people in the territory knew Gideon Mercer by reputation, if not by face. Blackstone Ranch, over the ridge east of Carson Bluff, was one of the largest horse operations in the region. He didn't come to auctions often, which meant when he did come, people noticed. Mercer, Harlan said, and something shifted in his voice. Not quite deference, something more careful than that. This isn't your business. Man grabbing at a woman's rope in a public yard seems like everybody's business, Gideon said. He still hadn't raised his voice. He still hadn't moved. Let go. Harlan held for another beat, long enough to make sure it didn't look like he was backing down. Then he released the rope. He did it slowly, deliberately, like it was his choice and not a retreat. She's trying to sell a horse that isn't legally hers, he said, addressing the crowd now rather than Gideon, pivoting to performance. I'm just trying to save somebody here a bad purchase. That's very generous of you, Gideon said, in a tone that made generosity sound like a charge. Harlan's jaw tightened. He looked at Vivian, then back at Gideon, reading whatever calculation he was making. Then he turned and walked away through the crowd, which parted for him more slowly this time. Vivian let out a breath. Her hand was still clenched around the lead rope. She made herself unclench it. Gideon walked over. He stopped a respectful distance away and looked at Willow first, the way horsemen always did, taking her in from feet to ears with the systematic attention of someone who'd been evaluating animals his whole life. She's a good animal, he said. She's exceptional, Vivian said, because it was true, and because she wasn't interested in underselling the last thing she had. Pruitt's going to make trouble at the bidding, Gideon said. He's got enough friends here to keep the price down if he wants to. I know. What's your floor? She looked at him. Why? Because I'm thinking about bidding, he said simply. Vivian studied him the way she'd been taught to study a situation before she committed to it, looking for the angle, the thing she wasn't seeing yet. Gideon Mercer didn't strike her as the kind of man who did things without reason. He was already looking back at the horse, not at her, which was unusual. Most men who spoke to her spent considerably less time looking at the horse. 200, she said. That's below her value. What's her bloodline? Ashcroft breeding. 3rd generation from the Comstock line. Her dam won 3 distance trials in 68 and 69. Her sire was the fastest quarter horse in Douglas County for 4 years running. Gideon nodded slowly, like he was filing this away. She trained to ride or to drive. Both. She's also calm enough to use in a breeding operation. She doesn't throw her foals. What does that mean? It means she's not a mare who produces difficult offspring. Her foals come out with her temperament. That's rare in a line this athletic. Gideon was quiet for a moment. He walked around Willow once, slow, looking at her from every angle. Willow watched him go, her ears swiveling to track him, but she didn't shift or tense. She likes you, Vivian said. I haven't done anything yet. That's why she likes you. Gideon came back around to the front, looked at Vivian, and seemed to make some kind of decision. I'll bid on her, he said. Fair price. If Pruitt tries to run the bidding dirty, I've got enough standing here that it won't work. Why would you do that? Vivian asked. You don't know me. Gideon looked at her for a moment. Not in the way men usually looked at her, cataloging her face, measuring her, figuring out what she was worth in whatever currency they were dealing in. He looked at her like she was a problem he was genuinely trying to solve. I knew your father, he said. Not well. We crossed paths twice, maybe 3 times. He was an honest man. He paused. There aren't enough of those. Before Vivian could respond, the auctioneer's voice cracked over the yard, calling all sellers to register their animals for the afternoon lineup. The morning's casual trading was ending. The real auction was starting. Think about it, Gideon said, and walked off toward the registration table. Vivian stood beside Willow and tried to think clearly. She wasn't sure she was managing it. The auction ran 12 animals before Willow's number came up. Vivian stood in the holding pen beside the mare, watching the crowd through the slats, watching Harlan Pruitt work his way along the fence line, stopping to talk to this buyer and then that one. She could see the effect of it, men nodding, pulling back slightly, the subtle body language of disengagement. He was patient about it. He was good at it. When Willow's number was called, Vivian led her into the ring. The auctioneer, a fat, good-natured man named Porter, who'd been running this auction for 20 years, looked Willow over with practiced eyes and opened at $75, which was a reasonable starting point for an animal of her quality. Vivian had expected it to go quickly to 100 and then climb from there. Instead, there was a long silence. A few hands went up half-heartedly. $80. A pause. 85. Another pause. Porter looked around the ring with the slightly confused expression of a man who knew the crowd wasn't behaving the way the animal warranted. Vivian's stomach dropped. She could feel it happening, could feel Harlan's invisible work settling over the bidding like a cloth dropped over a fire. $90. No new hands. Porter drew a breath to call it. 225. Gideon's voice cut through the yard from the far side of the ring. He'd raised his hand once, briefly, and put it back in his pocket. The crowd shifted. Porter blinked. Even he knew the jump was dramatic. From 90 to 225 was not a number someone threw out carelessly. It was a statement. On the far side of the fence, Vivian saw Harlan Pruitt go very still. 225. Porter gathered himself and asked for any advance. Someone near the gate offered 230, cautiously. Gideon's hand came up again without any particular urgency. 250. The cautious bidder went to 260. Gideon, 280. There was a long pause. Harlan Pruitt moved through the crowd toward the bidding side. He raised his hand. 300. Gideon looked across the ring, past the crowd, and found Harlan's face. Whatever passed between them in that look was something Vivian couldn't read from where she stood, but she saw Harlan's chin come up slightly, the way men's chins did when they were committing to something. 350, Gideon said. Silence. Porter waited. Harlan held. The number was real money, and Harlan's face was doing the calculation behind his eyes, and whatever the calculation came out to, it wasn't worth it. His jaw moved. He shook his head once, barely, and looked away. $350, Porter called. Going once, going twice. He looked around the ring with the professional patience of a man who'd seen every kind of drama an auction could produce. Nobody moved. Sold. Vivian walked out of the ring with Willow's lead in her hand and $350 worth of transaction being recorded at the registration table, which meant money she would not see because the money was going to the buyer, which was the entire point. She was selling, not buying, and she stood just outside the ring gate and Gideon Mercer walked over and held out his hand. Good horse, he said. She shook his hand because there was nothing else to do. She is, Vivian said. Her voice was steady. She didn't know how. She's the best horse you'll ever own. I don't doubt it. He looked at her, then at Willow, then back. I want to ask you something, and I want you to hear it before you answer. All right? I'm not looking for a hand, he said. Blackstone's got plenty of workers. What I'm looking for is someone who knows horses the way you clearly know horses. Someone who can help manage the breeding program. Not follow instructions, but help design them. He paused. What your father built was exceptional. I'd like to rebuild some of that properly, with someone who understands where it came from. Vivian looked at him for a long time. The sounds of the auction continued around them, horses moving, men calling, the ordinary machinery of the frontier proceeding without any regard for what was being decided in this 10 feet of dusty yard. What exactly are you offering? She said. Room and board, fair wage. Your horse stays at Blackstone until you decide what to do with her. He paused again. No obligations beyond the work. And if I decide to leave? Then you leave, he said, with your horse and your wages and whatever you've put together. She looked at Willow, who was watching her with the patient, dark-eyed attention the mare always gave when Vivian was making up her mind about something. I'll need to see the breeding records, Vivian said, before I commit to anything. Gideon nodded. That's fair. And I'll tell you what I think. even when you don't want to hear it. I'd expect nothing less, he said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. I suspect I'm going to hear quite a bit that I don't want to hear. Probably, she said. Then, all right. She said it simply, without theater, the same way she'd say yes to any reasonable business proposition, because that was what this was. It wasn't rescue, it wasn't charity, it was work, which was the one thing she knew how to do. Harlan Pruitt found her 20 minutes later while she was loading Willow's tack into the back of Gideon's wagon. He didn't come close. He stopped far enough away that he could pretend, if pressed, that he hadn't been heading for her at all. You know what kind of man Mercer is, he said. The kind who paid a fair price for a good horse, she said, without looking up from the tack. The kind who always wants something in return, Harlan said. You watch yourself. She straightened up and looked at him then, directly, the way her father had taught her to look at a man who was trying to put something on her that didn't belong to her. Thank you for the warning, she said. I'll be sure to remember who offered it. Harlan's mouth tightened. He turned and walked away. Gideon was coming back from the registration desk with the transfer papers when he passed Harlan on the path. They didn't speak. Harlan didn't look at him. Gideon watched him go, then came the rest of the way to the wagon. He's not finished, Gideon said quietly, looking at the direction Harlan had gone. I know, Vivian said. He wanted that horse for a reason, not sentiment. No, she agreed. Not sentiment. She climbed up onto the wagon seat and Willow's lead tied to the back, and the afternoon sun was moving west, and Carson Bluff was falling behind them, and ahead of them was the long ridge road that led east toward Blackstone. Gideon drove without talking for a while, which she appreciated. The silence was comfortable in the way silences sometimes were between people who didn't feel the need to fill them with performance. You said you knew my father, she said finally. Twice, he said. Once at an auction in Elko, once at a breeders' meeting in '69. He paused, choosing the word. Exact. He knew what a thing was worth, and he said so, didn't dress it up. No, she said. He didn't. I looked into the foreclosure, Gideon said. When I heard about it, she looked at him. Why? Kept his eyes on the road. Because the numbers didn't make sense. Thomas Ashcroft didn't carry that kind of debt load. He wasn't that kind of operator. He paused. I didn't find anything I could prove. But the bank moved very fast, and some of the creditors listed weren't names I recognized from any legitimate operation in the territory. Vivian was very quiet for a moment. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was watching the road ahead. And something she had kept very carefully locked down in the weeks since her father's death was pressing against the inside of her chest. I couldn't prove it either, she said. My attorney looked. There wasn't enough time. No, Gideon said, there wasn't. Another silence, different from the first one. Is that why you bid on her? Vivian said. On Willow? Gideon considered the question for a moment. Partly, he said, and partly because you didn't let go of the rope when Pruitt pulled. He paused. That told me something. She wasn't sure what it told him. She wasn't sure what it told her either. She'd been too frightened to let go, mostly. Fear and stubbornness could look a lot like courage from the outside. The ridge road climbed through a stand of juniper, and then the land opened up, and Vivian could see across the valley to where Blackstone Ranch sat in the middle distance. White fences, dark barns, a long low house with a porch that caught the afternoon light. It was a good spread. That much was clear even from this distance. Someone had built it carefully and maintained it the same way. Tell me about your breeding program, Vivian said. What are you working with? And Gideon began to talk, and she began to listen, and the wagon moved east, and Willow walked behind it with her ears forward and her step easy, and the auction yard at Carson Bluff was already behind them, like something that had happened a long time ago to people who were slightly different versions of who they were becoming. Vivian did not look back. She was already cataloging what Gideon had said, already sorting the problems from the possibilities, already building in her mind the shape of the work that was waiting for her. She hadn't asked to start over. She hadn't asked for any of this. But she had $9 and a good horse and a job that needed doing, and she had never in her life been able to look at work that needed doing and walk away from it. Her father had called it her best quality and her worst one in the same breath. She thought he was probably right. Behind them, in the Carson Bluff auction yard, Harlan Pruitt stood at the fence and watched the wagon climb the ridge road until it disappeared over the top. His small, pale eyes were still. His arms were crossed. He had wanted that horse for reasons that had nothing to do with the horse. He had time. He was a patient man when patience served him. And Vivian Ashcroft, for all her stubbornness and her dead father's reputation and her $9 and her one remaining horse, was 3 miles from nowhere on her own. For now. He turned and walked back through the auction yard, and the crowd moved aside for him the way it always did, and his boots raised small clouds of dust with every step, and he was already thinking about what came next. Blackstone Ranch looked different up close than it had from the ridge road. From a distance, it had the clean geometry of something well planned. White fences running straight, barns sitting square. The main house set back from the road at an angle that caught morning light without catching the worst of the afternoon heat. From a distance, it looked like something out of a cattleman's dream, orderly and permanent and sure of itself. Up close, Vivian could see the fence boards that needed replacing, the barn roof on the east side where 3 shingles had warped and lifted, the corral gate that hung 2 inches low on its hinges and scraped a shallow groove in the dirt every time someone opened it. None of it was neglect exactly. It was the particular kind of wear that came from a large operation running hard, where there were always 12 urgent things ahead of any one maintenance problem, and the maintenance problems accumulated in the background like a quiet debt. She noticed all of it on the ride in, cataloging it the way she cataloged everything, because that was how her father had taught her to see a place. Not what it looked like at first glance, what it told you when you looked at the parts that weren't being shown off. What Blackstone told her was that it was real. It was a working ranch, not a showpiece, and whoever ran it cared more about the horses inside the fences than the fences themselves. That was something. Gideon had barely finished setting the wagon brake when a woman came out of the main house and stood on the porch with her arms crossed, watching them pull in. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, lean and sharp-featured, with Gideon's same dark eyes and none of his patience in them. She had her hair pulled back severely, and she was wearing a canvas apron over a work dress, and she looked like a woman who had been interrupted doing something important and was not entirely pleased about it. "That's Naomi," Gideon said without preamble. "My sister. She runs the house." "She looks thrilled to see me," Vivian said. "She doesn't know about you yet." Vivian looked at him. "You brought me here without telling her?" "I made the decision at the auction," he said. "She wasn't at the auction." "You might have considered—" Vivian stopped herself. It wasn't her household. It wasn't her argument to make. Not yet, anyway. She climbed down from the wagon, and Naomi came off the porch steps, and the 2 women met in the yard in front of the hitching post, and Naomi looked her over with the same systematic attention Gideon had given Willow at the auction, starting at her feet and working up, taking inventory. "Vivian Ashcroft," Gideon said. "She's going to be working with the breeding program. She knows the bloodlines better than anyone I've met." "Does she?" Naomi said. She was still looking at Vivian, not at her brother. "Thomas Ashcroft's daughter." "Yes," Vivian said. "I knew your father's reputation," Naomi said. Her tone was careful in the way tones were careful when they were being kept from saying something else. "He built something impressive." "He did. And then he lost it." "Naomi," Gideon said. "I'm just noting the facts," Naomi said. She looked at her brother for the first time. "Where is she staying?" "The east room in the bunkhouse, the private end." "That room needs the mattress replaced." "Then replace it," Gideon said. "I'll bring in her horse and get her settled." Naomi held her brother's eyes for a moment, some conversation happening in that look that Vivian couldn't fully translate but understood well enough. Naomi wasn't pleased. She was going to comply anyway because whatever the dynamic was between them, it didn't include her overruling him. But she wasn't pleased, and she was making sure he knew it. She turned back to Vivian. "Supper's at 6, she said. "We eat together in the main house. You're welcome at the table." A beat. "We'll see how it goes from there." She went back inside. The screen door closed behind her with the particular firmness of a door that wasn't quite being slammed. "Don't mind her," Gideon said. "I don't," Vivian said. Which wasn't entirely true, but it was the right thing to say, and she'd learned the difference between what was true and what was right to say earlier than most people did. She got her carpet bag and followed Gideon across the yard toward the bunkhouse. The hands who were still working in the late afternoon saw her. She was aware of it the way she was always aware of being seen in places she wasn't expected. The pause in activity, the exchange of looks, the small recalibrations men made when something unexpected walked into their territory. She kept her eyes forward and her chin level, and she followed Gideon's lead without rushing. The east room in the bunkhouse was small and smelled of pine boards and old leather and the particular dusty neutrality of a space that hadn't been occupied recently. The mattress was, as Naomi had said, in need of replacement, lumpy in the middle and thin on both ends. The window faced east, which meant morning light, which Vivian had always preferred. There was a washstand, a small dresser with 2 of the 3 drawer knobs missing, and a hook on the wall for coats. "I'll get you what you need," Gideon said from the doorway. "Linens, lamp oil, whatever's missing." "It's fine," she said. "The mattress isn't fine. I've slept on worse." She set her carpet bag on the dresser and turned around. "Show me the breeding records tonight if you have time. I want to understand what I'm starting with." Gideon looked at her for a moment. "You just got here." "I know. Show me the records." Something moved in his expression. Not quite amusement, but not entirely without it. He turned and left, and Vivian sat on the edge of the questionable mattress and breathed in the smell of her new situation and told herself quietly and firmly that this was going to work, that she was going to make it work, that she had not come this far and kept her grip on Willow's lead rope in front of Harlan Pruitt's pale, calculating eyes in order to spend the next month being tentative. She stayed on the mattress for exactly 3 minutes. Then she got up and went to find the barn. The breeding barn was the largest structure on the property, set back from the main working area with its own separate fence line. Vivian slipped inside before anyone told her she could, because it was easier to ask forgiveness in a barn than permission, and because she needed to understand the operation she was walking into before she sat across a desk from Gideon Mercer and told him what she thought. There were 14 mares in the breeding barn. She walked the line slowly, looking at each one, checking their condition, reading what she could from the way they held themselves. Weight distribution, muscle development, the quality of their coats, the alertness in their eyes. 3 of them were visibly pregnant. 2 others were in that ambiguous middle stage where you needed a trained eye to tell. The rest were at various points in their cycles, which she couldn't determine just from looking. What she could determine was that 6 of the 14 were exceptional animals. 4 were solid. 4 were mediocre in ways that raised questions about who had made the selection decisions. She was crouched examining the near hind leg of a gray mare with suspicious heat in her fetlock, when she heard footsteps behind her and straightened up to find a man in his early 30s standing in the barn entrance, looking at her with an expression that was working very hard to be neutral and not quite getting there. He was broad through the shoulders, with a square jaw and the permanently squinted eyes of someone who'd spent too much time in bright sun. He had a pitchfork in his hand, and he was wearing the posture of a man who considered this his territory. "Help you with something?" he said. "This mare has heat in her fetlock," Vivian said. "Left hind. How long has that been there?" The man blinked. He hadn't expected a diagnostic question. 2, 3 days, he said slowly. "Has anyone called the veterinarian?" Mercer usually handles the horse health himself. "Has he seen this?" A pause. "I don't know." "She needs to be seen today," Vivian said. Heat in a fetlock on a breeding mare at this stage can mean a dozen different things, and most of them get worse if you wait. The man's jaw moved. "And you are?" "Vivian Ashcroft," she said. "I'll be working the breeding program." She held out her hand. He looked at it for a moment, then shook it with the brief, slightly reluctant grip of someone who hasn't decided yet whether the situation warrants courtesy. "Cal Braden," he said. "I run the hands here." "Good," she said. "Then you can help me make sure that mare gets looked at today." Cal Braden held her gaze for another moment, some internal assessment running behind his eyes. She'd seen that look before. It was the look men gave her when they were trying to figure out whether she actually knew what she was talking about or whether she was performing knowledge she didn't have. She didn't explain herself further. In her experience, explaining yourself to that look only made it worse. "I'll mention it to Mercer," Cal said finally. "Thank you," she said, and went back to the gray mare's leg. Cal stood in the doorway for another few seconds, then left. Vivian could hear him cross the yard at a pace that was slightly faster than his normal one. She was still in the barn when Gideon came in 20 minutes later. He went straight to the gray mare, crouched the way she had, ran his hand down the leg, and felt the heat for himself. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "How bad?" he said. "Not bad yet," she said, "but it needs attention. If it's what I think it might be, she can't be bred next cycle." "What do you think it is?" "Early stage tendon inflammation. Possibly. I could be wrong. I'd need the vet to confirm. But the heat pattern is specific. It's not a joint issue." Gideon straightened up. He looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize as his default. That careful, assessing attention that didn't give much away, but didn't miss much either. "You found this in 20 minutes, he said. "I was looking," she said. "Cal's been in this barn every day for 2 years. "Cal's looking at a lot of things," she said. "He's not looking only at this." She paused. "I don't say that to criticize him. He's doing a foreman's job. A foreman's job isn't the same as a breeder's job." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Fair point," he said. "I'll get the vet out tomorrow morning." "Tonight would be better." He looked at her. "The vet's in town," she said. "It's not that far. If that's early tendon inflammation, 24 hours matters." He held her gaze for a long moment. She watched him weigh it, the inconvenience of pulling a veterinarian out on a weekday evening against the cost of being wrong about waiting. She didn't push further. She'd said what she needed to say. It was his ranch. "I'll ride for him after supper," Gideon said. "Tonight is better than tomorrow," she said, "but I appreciate the compromise." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. It was becoming a familiar, almost expression. "You're going to be trouble," he said. "Probably," she said, "but not the kind you're thinking." Supper that first night was the most carefully navigated meal Vivian could remember sitting through. The table in the main house was long enough for 8, but only 5 sat at it. Gideon, Naomi, Vivian, Cal Braden, and a younger hand named Pete Dawes, who was about 20 years old and hadn't yet learned how to keep his curiosity off his face. Naomi served the food without ceremony and sat at the opposite end of the table from Gideon, and the arrangement made it feel like 2 territories with a contested border running down the middle of the meal. Pete kept glancing at Vivian in the way young men glanced at her when they were trying not to be caught at it, which she was used to and ignored with the practiced ease of someone who'd been managing that particular situation since she was 16. Cal Braden ate steadily and said almost nothing, which she respected. Naomi asked her, with the surface courtesy of a hostess meeting a potential complication, how long she'd been working with horses. "Since I could walk," Vivian said. "Formally," Naomi said. "Professionally." "My father trained me from the time I was 8, Vivian said. "I was managing the breeding schedule at Ashcroft by the time I was 19. By 20, I was responsible for the selection decisions." She paused. "Professionally, I suppose that's about 4 years. Practically, it's closer to 14. Naomi absorbed this. "And what happened to the operation your father built?" "Naomi," Gideon said. "It's a fair question," Vivian said. She looked at Naomi directly. "The bank moved on his debts after he died. I didn't have time to contest it properly. The assets were liquidated." She paused. "I kept 1 horse." "The one Gideon bid on today?" "Yes." Naomi looked at her brother. "You paid over $300 for a horse you already had an agreement on." "The agreement was separate from the purchase," Gideon said. "She needed fair value for the animal. You could have arranged that privately." "Harlan Pruitt was there," he said. "It wasn't going to go private." Naomi's expression shifted at Pruitt's name, just slightly, just a tightening around the eyes. She looked at Vivian again. "Pruitt wanted the horse?" "He made a private offer before the auction," Vivian said. "When I refused, he told the buyers there was a lien on her." "Was there?" "No." Naomi sat back slightly. She was thinking about something, working it through behind her eyes, and whatever she was working through changed the quality of her assessment of Vivian in some way that Vivian couldn't entirely read. "He's been sniffing around the north boundary again," Naomi said to Gideon. "3rd time this month." "I know," Gideon said. "What's on the north boundary?" Vivian asked. Both Mercers looked at her, a slight surprise at the directness of the question. She didn't take it back. "Water," Gideon said after a moment. "A year-round spring that runs into the upper pasture. It's the only reliable water source in this part of the territory when the summer droughts come in. And Pruitt wants access to it." "Pruitt wants to own it," Naomi said. "There's a difference." There was a silence at the table. Pete Dawes was looking at his plate now. Cal Braden had stopped chewing and was watching the exchange with the quiet attention of someone who'd heard pieces of this before and was interested in how Vivian fit into it. He didn't want Willow because of her bloodlines, Vivian said slowly. She was thinking out loud, which she didn't usually do, but the shape of something was forming in her mind and she needed to hear it to check it. Or not only that, she's the last of my father's documented line. If he owns her, he controls the provenance. Meaning, Gideon said, meaning he could breed her and register the foals under whatever papers he created, she said. My father's bloodlines are worth money, but they're worth more money if they're properly documented and traceable. Without the documentation, you've just got a good horse. With it, you've got a breeding legacy. She paused. And my father kept his papers, very careful papers. I have copies of all of them. Naomi looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at Vivian. Where are those copies? Safe, she said. Not in a place Pruitt can get to them. You're sure of that? I'm sure of it, she said. And then, because she was not going to start a new working arrangement with a lie of omission. They're in a strongbox at the land office in Carson City. I filed them as protected documents under my father's estate before the bank could touch them. She paused. The attorney I hired was not entirely useless. Naomi made a small sound that might, under other circumstances, have been a laugh. The meal continued. The dynamic at the table shifted, not dramatically. It wasn't the kind of shift you could point to and name, but something had settled. Some question that had been hanging over the meal had answered itself, or begun to. After supper, Gideon rode for the veterinarian. Vivian helped Naomi clear the table, which she did without being asked, because she had grown up in a household where you didn't sit while other people worked, and she wasn't about to start now. Naomi handed her a stack of dishes to carry to the kitchen and said, without looking at her, "He's not a simple man to work for." "I didn't come here looking for simple," Vivian said. "He makes decisions fast, and he doesn't always explain them," Naomi said. "It makes people assume the wrong things about his reasons, like bringing me here without telling you first." Naomi looked at her then. "Like that," she said. "For what it's worth, it's not personal. He does the same thing to me, and I've known him 40 years. "I understand," Vivian said. And then, "I don't need it to be easy. I need it to be honest." Naomi looked at her for a long moment. "All right," she said, in a tone that was not warm exactly, but was something more useful than cold. It was a start. Vivian understood starts. She'd been making them her whole life. The next 2 weeks were the hardest kind of hard. Not dramatic hard, not crisis hard, but the grinding daily hard of establishing yourself in a place where your presence is still a question mark, where every decision you make is being watched and evaluated by people who haven't decided yet whether to trust you. Cal Braden watched her with the careful, arm's-length skepticism of a man who ran a tight operation and was not immediately convinced that what Gideon had brought back from the auction was an asset and not a complication. He wasn't rude. He was precise and professional and exactly as cooperative as the job required and not 1 degree warmer. Every time she made a recommendation that intersected with his work, she could feel him measuring it against his own instincts, and only when the evidence came in to support her, the gray mare's tendon inflammation confirmed by the veterinarian that first evening, the adjustment to the breeding schedule that improved the timing on 2 of the pregnant mares, did she feel the measuring shift, fraction by fraction, towards something more like acknowledgement. The ranch hands were more straightforward in their skepticism. They didn't bother being subtle. She heard the comments, not aimed at her directly, never quite loud enough to require response, but loud enough to be heard, which was the point. "Prettiest barn manager I ever saw. Bet she knows a lot about horses. Real lot." The usual inventory of doubts dressed up as jokes, as frontier wit, as the particular way men tested the women they didn't expect to stay. She didn't respond to any of it. She just worked. She worked from first light to the end of the afternoon light, and sometimes past it. She revised the breeding schedule based on what she found in Gideon's records, which were thorough in some areas and frustratingly thin in others, and she told him exactly what was missing and what she needed to fill the gaps. She spent time with every mare in the breeding barn, learning their individual temperaments, their particular triggers and tolerances, the subtle language each animal used to tell you what it needed if you knew how to listen. She identified 2 more health concerns. a mare with early nutritional deficiency, and a stallion who was being worked too hard too close to his breeding schedule. And she brought each one to Gideon directly and told him what she saw and what she thought needed to happen. He listened. He didn't always agree immediately. He pushed back on the stallion assessment with the specific resistance of a man who'd made his own evaluation and wasn't ready to set it aside. She made her case calmly, using the evidence she'd accumulated, and then she told him it was his ranch and his decision, and she'd implement whatever he decided. He came back to her 2 days later and told her she'd been right about the stallion. He said it plainly, without dressing it up or minimizing it, and she respected him for that more than she would have for a man who just agreed with her in the first place. The crisis, when it came, arrived in the form of the Delaney women. There were 3 of them. Ellen Delaney, who ran the neighboring homestead to the west with her 2 adult daughters, Cora and Mira. They arrived on a Tuesday morning when Gideon was in town for a supplies run, and they arrived together, which Vivian understood immediately was intentional. She was in the corral working with a young filly, an animal that had developed a bad spooking habit from some previous mishandling, when she heard the wagon come in. She finished what she was doing with the filly, because the work didn't stop for social calls, and because interrupting a training session half done was worse than not starting it, and then she led the filly back to her pen and came out to the yard. Ellen Delaney was a woman in her late 40s with a rancher's practical face and sharp, pale eyes that reminded Vivian unpleasantly of Harlan Pruitt. She'd clearly been someone's idea of beautiful 20 years ago, and she'd retained enough of it to make you notice, and she wore that particular kind of not-quite smile that was most comfortable on the face of a woman who had decided what she thought about you before she arrived. Cora, the older daughter, was tall and quiet and stood slightly behind her mother in a way that suggested she was used to that position. Mira, the younger one, was about Vivian's age and had the bright, watchful eyes of someone who genuinely wanted to see what was going to happen. "You must be the woman Gideon brought back from the auction," Ellen said, without offering her name first. "Vivian Ashcroft," Vivian said. She didn't offer her hand because Ellen Delaney clearly wasn't going to shake it. "We heard there'd been some excitement out there," Ellen said. "Harlan Pruitt's been talking." She looked Vivian over with the same systematic inventory Naomi had used, but where Naomi's had been assessing capability, Ellen's was assessing threat. "He says Gideon overpaid for a horse that doesn't belong to you." "Willow belongs to me," Vivian said. "I have documentation, and Gideon paid a fair price." "Harlan seems to think otherwise." "Harlan's opinion isn't relevant to the legal status of my property," Vivian said. "If he has a genuine complaint, he can take it to the county clerk." Ellen's not-quite smile thinned. "You're very direct," she said. "I found it saves time," Vivian said. Cora was looking at the ground. Mira was looking at Vivian with something that was on the edge of admiration, which Vivian filed away without showing that she'd noticed. "We've known Gideon Mercer for 15 years, Ellen said. "This ranch has been good neighbors to us." The implication was audible. "Whatever you are, we were here first. We just wanted to come by and introduce ourselves." "That's very kind," Vivian said. "Gideon's in town today, but I'll let him know you called." Ellen's eyes moved past Vivian toward the barn, toward the corral, taking in the evidence of work. The freshly turned soil in the exercise yard, the new arrangement of the breeding barn's paddock fencing that Vivian had reconfigured 2 days earlier. She was cataloging changes, Vivian realized. She'd come here to see what had changed. "You've been busy," Ellen said. "There's a lot to do," Vivian said. "Gideon always managed well enough on his own," Ellen said. The tone was light. The content wasn't. "He did," Vivian agreed. "He'll manage better with a proper breeding program." There was a silence. A dry wind moved through the yard and kicked up a small dust curl near the wagon wheel. "Well," Ellen said, gathering herself, "we'll let you get back to it." She turned toward the wagon. Cora followed immediately. Mira lingered half a step, looked at Vivian directly, and said quietly, "The filly you were working with. She spooked bad with our old hand before we let him go. I didn't think anyone could get close to her." "She just needs patience," Vivian said, "and someone who doesn't take it personally when she bolts." Mira nodded, something settling in her expression. She climbed up into the wagon beside her mother and sister, and the wagon turned out of the yard. Vivian stood and watched it go, and she was still standing there when Naomi came out of the main house and crossed the yard to stand beside her. "Ellen Delaney," Naomi said. It wasn't a question. Yes. She's had her eye on Gideon for years, Naomi said. Has the idea that her Cora would be a good match for him. I see, Vivian said. She's not a bad woman, Naomi said. She's territorial. There's a difference. I know the difference, Vivian said. I'm not here for Gideon. Naomi was quiet for a moment. I know that, she said. Ellen doesn't. That's Ellen's problem. Naomi made that sound again, the almost laugh. It was becoming more frequent. Vivian was starting to consider it a small victory each time it happened. Cal Braden found her that evening at the end of the working day, when she was finishing her notes on the breeding adjustments she'd made that week. He stood in the doorway of the small office Gideon had cleared out for her use and held his hat in his hands, which was the frontier equivalent of a white flag. The Reardon mare, he said, the one with the nutritional issue. I've been watching her the last few days like you said. I think you're right. She looked up from her papers. I know, she said. I adjusted her feed mix yesterday. Cal nodded. He turned his hat in his hands once, twice. The men have been talking, he said. About you. I know that too, she said. I told them to stop, he said. He said it flatly, not as an apology, just as a fact. Don't matter whether any of us thinks Mercer made the right call bringing you here. You're here, and you know what you're doing, and we run a professional operation. It wasn't warm. It wasn't a speech about respect or fairness. It was a foreman telling her that the behavior would be correct going forward, delivered in the same tone he'd used to tell someone to fix a broken fence post. It was exactly what she needed. Thank you, Cal, she said. He put his hat back on and left. Outside the office window, she could hear the sounds of the ranch settling into evening. Horses moving in their stalls, the creak of the barn, men's voices crossing the yard in the easy, tired shorthand of people at the end of a working day. It was not home. She didn't pretend it was. But it was real and solid, and she was in it. And she had held her ground against Harlan Pruitt's public humiliation and Ellen Delaney's territorial inspection and Cal Braden's quiet skepticism. And she was still here, and Willow was in the barn eating well, and the gray mare's tendon was responding to treatment, and the breeding schedule she'd redesigned was already beginning to work. Her father used to say that you couldn't tell whether you'd made the right choice until you'd made it 3 times. Once when you chose, once when it was hard, and once when it turned out the way it turned out. She was still in the hard part. She picked up her pen and went back to work. 3 days later, she was working with the difficult stallion in the round pen. Not riding him, not trying to, just standing in the pen and letting him make the decisions about distance. A technique her father had shown her that most men didn't have the patience for. When she heard footsteps on the fence rail and looked over to find Gideon standing there, watching. She didn't stop what she was doing. The stallion's ear flicked toward Gideon at the sound of his arrival, and she spoke quietly to bring his attention back, a low, even sound that wasn't quite a word, just a frequency the horse had learned to associate with calm. Gideon watched for a long time without speaking. The stallion came to her eventually, as she'd known he would, turning his nose in toward her shoulder with the tentative, deliberate motion of an animal choosing trust. She stood still and let him make the contact on his terms, and then slowly raised her hand to his jaw. How long does that take? Gideon said from the fence. Quiet, so as not to startle the horse. Depends on the horse, she said. Him, about 40 minutes, first time. Now it's down to 20. Cal was wrong about him, Gideon said. Cal was doing his best with what he knew, she said. He's never worked a horse this sensitive. He was treating him like a difficult animal. He's not difficult. He's specific. What's the difference? Difficult means the animal is the problem, she said. Specific means you have to figure out what the animal needs, which is harder work, but it's not the horse's fault. Gideon was quiet for a moment. My father would have called that splitting hairs. Your father might have sold a good stallion for being difficult, she said. I'm trying to make sure you don't. She came out of the round pen and latched the gate, and the stallion moved to the center of the pen and stood watching her go with his ears forward, which was the best possible outcome. Gideon fell into step beside her as she crossed the yard. Pruitt came into town while I was there yesterday, he said. She looked at him. What did he want? He's been talking to the county recorder, Gideon said, asking questions about the Ashcroft estate settlement, whether the documentation is complete. It is, she said. I told you. I know, he said, but he's digging. And the man he's talking to at the county recorder's office is not, he paused, choosing the word. Pruitt has friends in that office. Vivian stopped walking. The implications of that arranged themselves in her mind in the way implications did when they were bad, each one connecting to the next, building something worse than the sum of the parts. He's trying to find a paperwork angle, she said. That's my read. How specific is the error that excluded Willow from the estate inventory? Specific enough that it holds up on its face, Gideon said. But it's the kind of thing that could be questioned if someone put a motivated lawyer at it. She started walking again. Her jaw was tight. She made herself unclench it. I need to get to Carson City, she said. To the land office. I need to review those filings. I can take you Saturday, Gideon said. I need to go sooner than Saturday. He glanced at her. I can go Thursday. Thursday, she said. They walked the rest of the way across the yard without speaking, and the evening was coming in from the east. In the particular purple and gold way Nevada evenings came in when the weather was clear, and Vivian was calculating everything she knew about Harlan Pruitt and everything she didn't know yet, and the thing she didn't know yet felt larger than the thing she did, which was not a comfortable feeling for a woman who believed in being prepared. But she had 3 days before Thursday, and there was work to do until Thursday. There was always work to do, and she had never been someone who let fear of what was coming stop the work that was happening right now. She went to check on the gray mare's tendon. The mare nickered when she came in, which was new, a recognition, an animal learning a person's footstep. Vivian ran her hand along the leg, checking the heat, checking the swelling, reading the small daily evidence of healing that was still slow but was real. Getting better, she told the mare. Slowly, but getting better. The mare pushed her nose gently against Vivian's shoulder. I know, Vivian said. Me too. Thursday came with a sky the color of old pewter and a wind out of the northwest that carried the smell of rain still 2 days away. Vivian was up before the light, which had become her habit in the 3 weeks she'd been at Blackstone, not because anyone required it, but because the early hour was the only time the ranch was quiet enough for her to think without interruption, and she had a great deal to think about. She fed Willow herself before the other hands were stirring, standing in the dim barn with the mare's warm breath against her neck and the comfortable smell of hay and horse around her, working through what she knew about the land office filings, and what she expected to find when she got there, and what she would do if what she found was worse than she expected. She had learned over the past weeks that expecting the worst was not pessimism. It was preparation. The worst had a habit of arriving whether you expected it or not, and it was considerably less damaging when you'd already made a plan for it. Gideon had the wagon ready by the time she came out of the barn. He was tying down the canvas cover against the possibility of weather, working with the efficient, no-wasted motion economy of a man who'd done physical work his whole life. He didn't look up when she came over. Naomi packed food, he said. It's under the seat. You didn't have to. It's a long drive, he said. Don't argue about the food. She didn't argue about the food. They were on the road before sunrise, the wagon moving at a steady pace on the main track south toward Carson City, the horses pulling easy in the cool morning air. The land stretched out flat on both sides of the track and then rose into ridges to the east, dark against the brightening sky. And Vivian sat on the wagon bench with her hands in her lap and watched the horizon come up. Tell me what you're worried about, Gideon said, not looking at her, watching the road. If Pruitt has found a way to question the estate exclusion, she said, Willow's legal status becomes uncertain. Not impossible to defend, but uncertain. And if her status is uncertain, her documentation, the Ashcroft breeding papers, becomes uncertain too. Can he manufacture a challenge out of nothing? Not out of nothing, she said. But the inventory error that excluded her was a clerical mistake, not a formal exemption. It was never tested. It was never reviewed. It's been sitting in the estate records as an unchallenged fact for 6 weeks, and unchallenged facts are much easier to challenge once someone decides to. What would he need to make it stick? A lawyer willing to argue it and a recorder's office willing to look the other way on timing, she said. He has the lawyer. You told me he might have the recorder. Gideon was quiet for a moment. The recorder's name is Aldous Webb, he said. He and Pruitt go back 15 years. Webb handles a lot of land transactions in that county. Most of them are clean. Most? She said. Most, he agreed. What do you know about Webb? Careful man, Gideon said. Not corrupt in the obvious way. More selective about which rules he applies strictly and which ones he applies with flexibility. He paused. The kind of man who doesn't take money directly, takes favors. What kind of favors does Pruitt have to offer? The water rights on Pruitt's North Range connect to the Webb family's grazing land, Gideon said. If Pruitt controls access, he controls Webb. It's not complicated. Vivian looked out at the road ahead. So Webb might be willing to find irregularities in the estate filing that a neutral reviewer wouldn't find. Might, Gideon said. I don't know that he has. I'm telling you the risk. I need to see the original filings, she said. All of them, not just the copies I have. That's why we're going. They drove another mile in quiet. A hawk crossed the road ahead of them, low and fast, and disappeared into the scrub on the far side. Can I ask you something? Vivian said. You're going to ask it regardless, Gideon said. She almost smiled. Why did you look into my father's foreclosure before the auction? You said you'd investigated and the numbers didn't make sense. That takes time and effort. You didn't know me. Gideon was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, your father sold me a horse once, he said. Not from his breeding stock, a working horse, a gelding, for ranch use. I paid him a fair price, and the horse turned out to be worth 3 times what I paid. He paused. I went back to tell him, and he said he'd priced the horse on what he knew at the time. He said he didn't charge people for what he found out later. Vivian was very still. He could have asked for more, Gideon said. He didn't. He said a deal was a deal, and the benefit of being right about an animal went to the buyer. Another pause. I didn't know many men like that. When I heard he'd died and the bank had moved on everything he owned before he was in the ground, it bothered me. She didn't say anything. She looked at the road. I'm sorry, Gideon said. I don't mean to. Don't apologize, she said. I want to hear it. She paused. He was like that with everything, not just horses. He thought a person's word was their most valuable possession, and once you spent it, you couldn't get it back. He was right about that. I know he was right about that, she said. I just wish being right had protected him better. Carson City was a 2-hour drive from Blackstone on clear roads, and the road stayed clear. The town was bigger than Carson Bluff, a proper county seat with a main street that ran 6 blocks and had a bank on one end and the county buildings on the other, and everything in between that a functioning town required. Vivian had been here 3 times with her father, and once alone, when she'd filed the protective documents in the weeks after his death. She remembered the land office clerk who'd helped her, a young man named Emmett, nervous and thorough, who'd triple-checked every document she filed and given her a receipt for each one. She hadn't known at the time whether she was being careful enough. She'd only known she needed to be careful. She knew now she'd been right to do it. The land office was at the back of the county building, behind a wooden counter that smelled of ink and paper and the close, particular mustiness of a room full of official records. The man behind the counter was not Emmett. The man behind the counter was in his late 50s, compact and precise, with the careful, neutral expression of someone who'd spent decades in a bureaucratic position and learned to reveal nothing on his face until he'd decided what he wanted to reveal. He looked at Vivian when she came in, and then at Gideon, and something moved briefly in his eyes before he put the neutral expression back in place. Aldous Webb, Gideon said quietly, beside her. She'd suspected as much. Miss Ashcroft, Webb said, which meant he knew who she was, which meant he'd been looking. And Mr. Mercer. He nodded at Gideon with the specific courtesy of a man maintaining appearances. What can I do for you today? I'm here to review the filings from the Thomas Ashcroft estate, Vivian said. Specifically the protective documentation I filed 6 weeks ago and the inventory records from the estate settlement. Of course, Webb said. He moved to the filing cabinets behind him with the unhurried pace of a man who had all day. It may take a few minutes to locate everything. It took 14 minutes. Vivian counted. When Webb brought the files to the counter, they were thick, thicker than she expected, which was the first thing that worried her. She had filed 7 documents. The stack he set in front of her was considerably more than 7 documents worth of paper. She opened the first folder. There were her original filings, exactly as she'd left them. Willow's exclusion from the inventory, documented by the clerical notation, the estate settlement agreement, the chain of ownership tracing back through 3 generations of Ashcroft breeding records. She went through each page methodically, checking dates, checking signatures, checking the recording stamps. Everything she'd filed was intact. But there was more. Filed after her documents, dated 2 weeks ago, was a formal inquiry submission. She read it twice, slowly, because she wanted to be sure she understood what she was looking at before she reacted to it. The inquiry, submitted by an attorney named Hartwell on behalf of an unnamed client, questioned the validity of the inventory exclusion on procedural grounds. It argued that a clerical notation was not a formal exemption, that the exclusion had never been reviewed by a qualified estate officer, and that the animal in question should be considered part of the estate assets pending a formal determination. It was careful language. It didn't accuse her of anything. It simply questioned. It raised procedural doubts in the way that procedural doubts were raised when someone wanted to tie up a legal matter without making an overt grab that could be challenged. She set the papers down on the counter. "There's a formal inquiry filed here," she said to Webb, questioning the exclusion of a specific asset from the Ashcroft estate. "Yes," Webb said. He had the flat, careful tone of a man who'd been expecting this conversation. "It was filed through proper channels." "Who is the unnamed client?" "The inquiry was submitted through legal representation," Webb said. "The client's identity is not a matter of required public disclosure at this stage of the process." "No," she said. "But I think we both know who it is." Webb's expression didn't change. "I wouldn't speculate about that," he said. Gideon, who had been standing quietly beside her reading the document over her shoulder, said, "Has the inquiry triggered a formal review?" "A preliminary review has been scheduled," Webb said. "Standard procedure." "Who conducts the preliminary review?" Gideon said. "The county estate officer," Webb said. "That would be myself." There it was. Vivian looked at the stack of documents, then at Webb, then at Gideon. Gideon's jaw was set in a particular way she'd learned to read, the way it set when he was holding something in rather than releasing it. "Mr. Webb," she said. Her voice was steady and deliberate. "The exclusion of that animal from the estate inventory is supported by the original documentation, by the estate settlement agreement, signed by all relevant parties, and by 6 weeks of uncontested legal standing. A clerical notation that was accepted at the time of settlement and not challenged during the settlement period is a completed legal fact." "The inquiry raises questions about the procedure," Webb said. "The inquiry was filed 14 days after the settlement closed," she said. "There's a window for challenges to estate settlements, and that window closed 12 days before this inquiry was submitted." Something shifted in Webb's expression. Just a fraction, just enough. "The filing date of the inquiry is a matter of record," he said carefully. "Yes," she said. "It is. And the filing date falls outside the legal challenge window, which means a preliminary review based on this inquiry has no procedural standing." She paused. "I'd like that noted in the official record." Webb looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Gideon. He looked back at Vivian. "I'll need to verify the timeline," he said. "The timeline is in the documents in front of you," she said. "The settlement closing date is on the first page. The filing date of the inquiry is on the cover sheet. The subtraction is not complicated." Another pause. Longer this time. "I'll need to review this matter before making any determination," Webb said. His voice had acquired a slight flatness, the sound of a bureaucrat retreating to procedure, because procedure was the only ground left. "You do that," Gideon said. It was the first thing he'd said in several minutes, and the evenness of it somehow carried more weight than anything louder would have. "And while you're reviewing it, you might want to note that there are at least 3 attorneys in this territory who take a professional interest in how estate settlements are administered in this county. I'd be happy to make some introductions." Webb looked at him. "Just a thought," Gideon said. They left the land office with the copies of everything. Every document in the file, original and inquiry both, with dates and recording stamps intact. Vivian had asked for copies of all of it, and Webb had provided them with the careful neutrality of a man recalculating his position. Outside on the street, Vivian stopped walking and stood for a moment in the thin winter sunlight, looking at the papers in her hands. Her heart was going faster than she wanted it to. She was good at presenting calm, and she'd done it in there. But calm was a thing you performed sometimes, and the performance was its own kind of exhaustion. "You knew about the challenge window," Gideon said. "My attorney told me," she said. When I filed the protective documents, he walked me through the settlement timeline specifically. He said if anyone tried to challenge the exclusion, the window was the first line of defense. He earned that partial payment, Gideon said. He did, she said. He really did. She folded the copies and put them in the inside pocket of her coat, next to the originals she'd brought with her from the strongbox. She had both sets now. Pruitt's lawyer could file whatever he liked. The dates were in the record, and the record didn't lie, and Aldous Webb knew she knew it. Pruitt will try something else, she said. Yes, Gideon agreed, but not this. He looked at her. You did well in there. I was terrified, she said. I know, he said. You didn't show it. That's the only useful thing about being terrified, she said. You get very focused. They ate Naomi's food in the wagon on the road back north. Cold biscuits and dried meat, and 2 apples that were past their best but still good. And Vivian felt the tension in her shoulders slowly begin to release with the miles. Not completely, not all the way, but enough to breathe more easily than she had since Gideon told her about Pruitt's visit to the county recorder's office. The drive back took longer because they stopped at the general store in Morrow Crossing, halfway home, where Gideon had a supply order waiting. While the supplies were loaded, Vivian walked the short main street of the small town and tried to let her mind rest from the problem of Pruitt for 20 minutes, which she almost managed. She was looking at a display of seed packets in the window of the feed store when someone spoke her name from behind her. She turned. Mira Delaney was standing 5 feet away with a basket over her arm, apparently having come out of the dry goods store next door. She looked surprised, and then quickly arranged her expression into something more neutral. Miss Ashcroft, she said. I didn't expect to see you this far out. Supply run, Vivian said, with Mercer. Mira's eyes went briefly to where the wagon was parked in front of the general store. Then back to Vivian. How are you settling in at Blackstone? Well enough, Vivian said. Mira shifted her basket. My mother came back from that visit in a particular mood, she said carefully. I don't always agree with how she stopped, started again. The filly you were working with, has she improved? Considerably, Vivian said. She's still cautious, but she's not bolting anymore. Give her another month. Mira nodded. Something in her posture loosened slightly. I've been trying to work with our 2 young horses at home, and I don't really know what I'm doing, she said. I grew up with cattle more than horses. My father had horses, but he didn't pass it on before he died. Vivian looked at her. How old are the horses? 3 and 4, both geldings. The 4-year-old is reasonably manageable. The 3-year-old is... She made a slight helpless gesture. Difficult. Difficult or specific, Vivian said. Mira blinked. I don't know the difference. I know, Vivian said. That's the problem. She thought for a moment. Come by Blackstone sometime. Bring the horse. I'll take a look. Mira stared at her. Why would you do that? Because you're not your mother, Vivian said, and because a horse that's struggling when it doesn't need to be bothers me more than it should. Mira was quiet for a moment. My mother won't like it, she said. That's between you and your mother, Vivian said. Something moved in Mira's face that looked like relief and looked like decision, the particular expression of someone who had been waiting for permission to make a choice they'd already made. All right, and she said, maybe next week. Any time, Vivian said. Just send word ahead so I know you're coming. She watched Mira walk back down the street toward wherever she'd left her horse, and then turned and went back to the wagon, and Gideon was there loading the last of the supplies, and looked at her with mild curiosity as she climbed up. Mira Delaney, he said. Yes. Ellen know you're making friends with her daughter? Ellen Delaney's feelings about my social arrangements are not something I'm concerned about, Vivian said. The corner of Gideon's mouth moved. Fair enough. They were an hour from Blackstone when the sky, which had been building something all day in the northwest, finally committed to it. The clouds came in fast, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees in 20 minutes, and the rain that had smelled like 2 days away arrived all at once, hard and cold, driving against the canvas cover and drumming on the wagon boards in the particular relentless way of a Nevada storm that had decided it was done waiting. Gideon pulled the canvas over them as best he could without stopping, driving through the rain with the practiced steadiness of someone who'd crossed this territory in worse conditions. Vivian pulled her coat tight and held the supply bag in her lap to keep it from sliding, and didn't complain about the cold because complaining about the cold was not going to make it less cold. You all right? Gideon said, raising his voice slightly over the rain. I'm fine, she said. You don't sound fine. I'm cold and wet, and I'm thinking about Pruitt trying again from a different angle, she said. But physically, I'm fine. He'll try the boundary, Gideon said. That's my read. He's lost the legal angle on Willow. Next move is the North Range water access. He's been building a case for contested boundary for 2 years. I think he'll push it now because he's angry. Angry men make mistakes, she said. Yes, he said, and they also cause damage while they're making them. She thought about that. The spring on the North Range, how is it documented? Survey from 1872, he said. Blackstone's deed includes the water rights explicitly. Has anyone verified the survey markers recently? A pause. Not in the last 5 years. She looked at him through the rain. Pruitt's had access to the north boundary, she said. You told me he's been up there 3 times this month. Gideon's jaw moved the way it did when he was processing something he didn't like. You think he's moved the markers? I think he might have moved the markers, she said. I think it's worth finding out before he makes any formal claim. Another pause, longer. The rain hammered the canvas and the horses moved steadily through it, heads down against the wet. I'll go up tomorrow morning, Gideon said. I'll come with you, she said. It's rough country up on the North Range. I know rough country, she said. He glanced at her sideways. I know you do, he said. I was giving you the option, not the limitation. She settled back on the bench. Tomorrow morning, then, she said. They made Blackstone just past dark, soaked through and cold, and the barn lights were on, and Cal had clearly heard the wagon coming because the barn doors were open when they pulled in, warm light spilling out into the wet dark. Cal took the horses' heads while Gideon climbed down, and Vivian handed the supply bag to Pete Dawes, who appeared out of nowhere to take it, and the ordinary machinery of the ranch receiving them home operated around her with an efficiency she was starting to recognize as the particular competence of a well-run outfit where people knew their work and did it without being directed. She hadn't expected to find that comforting. She found it comforting. Naomi had food on the stove and the main house was warm, and she handed Vivian a dry blanket from the hall closet without comment when she came through the door, which was the closest Naomi had come to maternal feeling in Vivian's direction, and she received it without making anything of it, which was the right response. At the table, over soup that was considerably better than anything Vivian had eaten since leaving the Ashcroft ranch, she laid out for Naomi exactly what they'd found at the land office. Naomi listened without interrupting, her hands around her coffee cup, her eyes moving occasionally from Vivian to Gideon and back. When Vivian finished, Naomi was quiet for a moment. Webb's going to drop it, Naomi said. He knows when he's overextended. I think so too, Vivian said. But Pruitt doesn't know yet that Webb's going to drop it. No, Naomi said. He doesn't. And in the meantime, we think he may have tampered with the North Range survey markers, Gideon said. Naomi set down her coffee cup with a careful, deliberate motion. That's a criminal matter, she said. Only if we can prove the markers were moved deliberately, Gideon said. If they've just drifted, if a fence post shifted, if a stone moved, it becomes a boundary dispute, civil, not criminal, long and expensive. We need to document the current positions against the original survey, Vivian said. Tomorrow, before Pruitt has any reason to think we're looking. Naomi looked at her. You're going to go up to the North Range tomorrow. Yes. With Gideon. Yes. Naomi turned her coffee cup in her hands, some thought moving behind her eyes that she didn't share. All right, she said finally. Take Cal. 3 sets of eyes are better than 2, and Cal knows that boundary better than either of you. Good thought, Gideon said. Naomi looked at him. I have them occasionally, she said. Then to Vivian, eat the rest of that soup. You look like you haven't been warm all day. Vivian ate the soup. She was not warm all day, and the soup helped. Later, when Gideon had gone to brief Cal and Naomi had gone to bed, Vivian sat alone at the kitchen table for a few minutes with the copies of the land office documents spread in front of her, going through them one more time in the quiet. The rain had eased to a steady sound on the roof, not the driven hammering of the road, but the settling rhythm of a storm that had said what it needed to say and was winding down. She thought about Harlan Pruitt standing at the fence of the Carson Bluff auction yard, watching the wagon take the ridge road. She thought about the way his eyes had followed them with the patience of a man who wasn't finished. She'd been right about that. He hadn't been finished. She gathered the documents and folded them and put them back in her coat pocket. Her father had always said that the most dangerous opponent wasn't the one who came at you directly. It was the one who was patient, who worked the angles, who waited for you to believe you were safe before he moved again. She had not believed she was safe. She was glad she hadn't. The lamp on the table was burning low, and the rain was still coming down, and somewhere in the barn, Willow was dry and fed and doing whatever horses did in the quiet hours of the night, and Vivian sat at the table a little longer than she needed to, just breathing, just letting the day be over. Then she turned down the lamp and went to bed. She was up before first light, the way she always was. And by the time she had Willow fed and saddled, because she was riding, not riding in the wagon, for this, Cal Braden was already in the yard with 2 horses ready and a look on his face that said he'd been briefed and had opinions about the situation that he was keeping to himself for the moment. Gideon came out of the main house with his coat on and a rolled survey document under his arm, and the 3 of them looked at each other in the gray pre-dawn with the specific wordless understanding of people who were about to go find out whether something bad had happened. "North boundary's about 2 hours from here in good conditions," Cal said. "Ground's going to be wet from last night. Might be closer to 3. "Then we'd better move," Vivian said. They moved. The North Range was high country, rising from the back of Blackstone's pastures into the ridge territory, where the land got rocky and the juniper thinned and the sky came in closer. Vivian had not been up here before. She'd seen it from the ranch yard as a dark shape against the horizon, but riding into it was different. The ground changed under the horses' feet, harder and more uneven, and the trail that Cal led them on was barely a trail in places, more a remembered line through the brush. But the spring was real. She heard it before she saw it. A low, steady sound in the rock, the particular music of water that moved year-round regardless of weather. When they crested the last rise and she saw it, she understood immediately why it mattered. It came out of the rock face on the north slope of the ridge and ran down into a natural basin before continuing east through the upper pasture. Clean, clear water, year-round, from the look of the rock around it, which showed the long mineral staining of a spring that never went dry. Whoever owned that spring owned the dry season survival of every operation within 3 miles of it. Cal had the original survey with him, a copy Gideon had had in the ranch files, and they found the first marker without difficulty. A carved stone post, about knee-height, set in the ground at the northwest corner of the water boundary. Cal crouched beside it and compared its position against the survey diagram, measuring by pacing the distance to the ridge feature that was the fixed reference point. He stood up slowly. "Off," he said. "How far?" Gideon said. "About 9 feet to the south," Cal said, "toward Blackstone. From the survey reference point, this stone should sit here." He marked an X in the wet dirt with his boot heel, 9 feet north of where the stone currently sat. "Somebody's moved it toward us, which means it looks like our boundary extends less far north than the survey says." Vivian looked at the second marker, which she could see from where she stood, another carved stone 20 yards east along the boundary line. "Let's check the other one," she said. The other one was off by 11 feet. Same direction, same pattern. Someone had moved both markers, moved them carefully and consistently, not sloppily, in a way that would be difficult to notice without the original survey for comparison. It had been done by someone who understood surveying, someone who'd had access to the original documents. Gideon crouched beside the second marker and looked at the ground around it. Vivian crouched beside him. The soil around the stone's base was slightly different in color from the surrounding ground. Not dramatically, not in a way you'd notice from horseback or from a distance, but at close range the disturbance was visible. Recently disturbed. The rain last night had softened the edges of it, but it was there. "When did it rain last before last night?" Vivian said. 8 days, Cal said. "We had a dry stretch." "Then this was done in the last 8 days, she said. "Before last night's rain, after the dry spell started." She looked at Gideon. "He was up here. One of those 3 times you mentioned." Gideon's hand rested on the stone. His jaw was set the way it got. He was quiet for a long time. "We document this," he said finally. "Everything. The current position, the survey position, the soil disturbance. We get a licensed surveyor up here before the week is out, and we have it all on record." "And then?" Cal said. Gideon stood up. He looked north toward where Pruitt's range began beyond the next ridgeline. His expression was not angry in the hot, demonstrative way of a man who needed to show his anger. It was something quieter and more settled, the specific quality of a decision being made. "And then," he said, "we go see the county sheriff." Vivian stood beside him and looked at the spring, still running, still clear, indifferent to the human contest being waged around it. The water didn't know whose it was. It just ran. She put her hand briefly on Gideon's arm, not in the way of comfort, not in the way of any particular intimacy, but in the simple, practical way of one person telling another that they were not doing this alone. He looked at her hand and then at her, and whatever he saw in her face he held for a moment before looking back at the spring. "All right," he said, "let's get this measured properly." Cal already had the measuring rope out. They got to work, and the spring ran steadily beside them, and the morning light came in cold and clear over the ridge, and Vivian wrote down every number Cal called out in the small notebook she'd started keeping in her coat pocket the day she arrived at Blackstone, because she had learned, from her father, from the months of watching the bank take everything he'd built, that the numbers mattered and the records mattered, and the person who kept the careful, accurate, unimpeachable record was the person who had something solid to stand on when the ground started shifting underneath. She wrote everything down. The surveyor's name was Harold Fitch, and he arrived at Blackstone 2 days after the North Range discovery with a leather satchel full of instruments and the professionally skeptical manner of a man who'd been called out to adjudicate boundary disputes before, and had learned not to form opinions before he had measurements. Gideon had ridden to Carson City the morning after they'd found the moved markers and retained Fitch through the Territory Surveying Office. An official engagement, documented, with a written commission that specified the purpose and the property. Vivian had suggested the formal paperwork. Gideon had agreed without needing to be told why. Everything that touched Pruitt's scheme needed to be on record in the right order, done the right way, because the right way was the only way that would hold up when it mattered. Fitch spent 4 hours on the North Range with his instruments and his careful, unhurried precision, and he did not talk while he worked, which Vivian respected. Cal walked the boundary with him and answered questions when Fitch asked them, and otherwise stayed quiet, which was its own kind of respect. Vivian stayed back near the spring and let the professionals do their work, and wrote notes on what she observed without injecting herself into the process. When Fitch came down from the ridge at midday, his face had the particular neutral expression of a man whose professional neutrality was working hard. He sat at the table in the ranch office with his measurements spread in front of him, and Gideon sitting across from him and Vivian in the chair against the wall. Present but not centered, because this was Gideon's property and his legal matter, and she was a witness, not a party. And he went through the numbers slowly, comparing what he'd found against the 1872 survey. "Both markers have been moved," he said. He said it plainly, without drama, in the tone of a man delivering a measurement rather than an accusation. "The northwest marker is 9 feet 4 inches south of its surveyed position. The northeast marker is 11 feet 1 inch south. The movement is consistent in direction and similar in magnitude." He paused. "In my professional assessment, this is not the result of ground shift, frost heave, or natural movement of any kind. The markers were physically relocated. The soil disturbance at both sites is consistent with extraction and replacement." "Could it have been accidental?" Gideon said. Fitch looked at him over his instruments. "Someone would have had to accidentally pull a 200-pound stone post out of the ground it had been set in for 50 years, carry it 9 feet south, and reset it in a new hole," he said. "Then do the same thing 11 feet away with a similar stone." He paused again. "No, it was not accidental." "I need that in writing," Gideon said. "You'll have a full written report by end of week," Fitch said. "Official, notarized, filed with the Territory Surveying Office." He began gathering his instruments. "For what it's worth, Mr. Mercer, whoever moved those markers knew what they were doing. They reset them at the right depth, packed the soil correctly, and picked a direction that would be hard to detect without the original survey for reference. This was planned." He left after Gideon paid his fee. The ranch office felt quieter after he was gone, the way a room felt quieter after something definitive had happened in it. Cal, who had leaned against the doorframe through the whole meeting, said, "Pruitt." "Yes," Gideon said. "You going to the sheriff?" "Today," Gideon said. "You want company?" Gideon looked at him. "You and Vivian," he said. Cal's eyes moved briefly to Vivian and back. Something in his expression had shifted. Not all the way, not a transformation, but a shift. "All right," he said. Sheriff Wade Connolly ran his operation out of a two-room office on the main street of Carson Bluff, which was closer than Carson City and had jurisdiction over the North Range territory, which was the relevant factor. Connolly was a large man in his mid-50s who had held the position for 12 years on the particular combination of competence and stubbornness that kept frontier lawmen in their seats. He was not a man easily moved by either complaint or influence, which was exactly what the situation required. He read Fitch's preliminary notes, a handwritten summary Fitch had provided before the formal report, with the unhurried attention of someone who read documents the way some men read tracts, looking for what was being told between the lines. When he finished, he set the papers down and looked at Gideon. "Fitch is solid," he said. "His professional assessment carries weight with the territory court." "That was the point of using him," Gideon said. "You're alleging deliberate tampering with survey markers," Connolly said. "That's criminal trespass and property fraud at minimum. Depending on intent and outcome, it climbs higher." He paused. "You know who you're pointing at." "Harlan Pruitt," Gideon said. Connolly didn't react visibly to the name. "You have evidence linking Pruitt specifically to the movement of those markers." "We know he's been on the north boundary 3 times in the last month," Gideon said. "And we know the markers were moved in the last 8 days based on the soil disturbance and the weather record. Knowing a man was in the vicinity is not the same as knowing he moved the markers," Connolly said. "No," Gideon agreed, "but combined with a formal inquiry filed at the land office questioning my ownership of the North Range water rights, filed by an attorney working for an unnamed client, filed 2 weeks ago, which is when Pruitt started making regular visits to my boundary. The pattern speaks." Connolly looked at the documents Vivian had set on his desk, the copies from the land office, the filing dates, the inquiry submission. He went through them at the same unhurried pace. "The inquiry was filed outside the legal challenge window," Vivian said. "The settlement closing date and the inquiry filing date are both on record." Connolly looked at her. "You're the Ashcroft girl," he said, not unkindly. "Vivian Ashcroft," she said. "I work the breeding program at Blackstone." He held her gaze for a moment, then looked back at the documents. "The land office inquiry is a civil matter," he said, "outside my jurisdiction." He paused. "The survey markers are inside my jurisdiction." "Yes," Gideon said. Connolly sat back in his chair, which made a sound under his weight that suggested it had been through many such conversations. "I'm going to open an investigation," he said. "Official, documented. I'll want Fitch's full report when it's ready. I'll want a statement from each of you, what you observed, when you observed it, in your own words." He looked at Gideon. "What I cannot promise you is an arrest on the timeline you'd prefer." "I understand that," Gideon said. "Pruitt's going to know you've been here," Connolly said. "This town doesn't hold information well. He'll know within the day." "Good," Vivian said. Both men looked at her. "He doesn't know we found the markers," she said. "He doesn't know about Fitch. He doesn't know we have the land office documentation on the inquiry timing. When he finds out we've been to the sheriff, his first instinct is going to be to verify that his scheme is still intact." She paused. "Men who have done something careful and hidden want to check on it when they feel threatened." Connolly regarded her with the specific attention he gave to things he was taking seriously. "You're saying he'll go back to the North Range," he said. "I'm saying he might," she said. "And if he does, he'll be looking at markers that have already been documented, surveyed, and photographed in their current wrong position. If he moves them back now, that's evidence of a second tampering, which is harder to explain than the first. And if he leaves them, the original evidence stands." "Either way," Cal said from the corner, where he had been standing with his arms crossed and saying nothing for 20 minutes. "He's holding a losing hand." Connolly looked at Cal, then back at Vivian, then at Gideon. "You've thought this through," he said. "We had 2 days," Gideon said. "She thought it through," Cal said. He said it without apparent self-consciousness, just as a fact. "The rest of us were mostly angry." Connolly almost smiled. "All right," he said. "Leave me the documents. I'll need written statements from all 3 of you before the end of the week. Fitch's formal report when it arrives. And tell Fitch I'll be in touch." He stood, which was the conclusion of the meeting. "And Miss Ashcroft?" She looked at him. "The land office inquiry," he said. Webb's not going to pursue it. My read is he's realized the filing date doesn't hold up. But if he does pursue it, you come back to me." He paused. "A county officer using a flawed filing to harass a legitimate property holder is inside my jurisdiction, even if the property question itself isn't." She felt something settle in her chest that had been held tight since Carson City. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "Thank whoever taught you to keep careful records." "My father," she said. He nodded once, slowly, like that made complete sense. "Good man," he said. "I knew him." He went back to his desk. They left. Outside on the street, the afternoon light was flat and cold, and Cal walked ahead of them toward the horses with the slightly faster pace of a man who needed a moment, and Gideon and Vivian walked behind him at the ordinary pace of people who'd done what they came to do and were still processing what that meant. "Webb's going to drop the inquiry," Gideon said quietly. "Yes," she said. "Pruitt's going to find out about the sheriff's investigation." "Yes." "And he's going to be angry," Gideon said. "Genuinely angry, not just calculating. He's put a significant investment into this scheme, and he can see it falling apart." "Angry men make mistakes," she said. "You said so." "I said that," he agreed. "I also said they caused damage on the way." She thought about that. "What kind of damage are you expecting?" He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," he said. "That's what worries me." The damage arrived 9 days later, and it did not look like what any of them had expected. It was Naomi who noticed it first, which made sense because Naomi noticed everything that moved on Blackstone property, and the movement she noticed was the absence of movement. Specifically, the fact that 3 mares who should have been in the upper breeding paddock in the morning were not in the upper breeding paddock. She found Vivian in the breeding barn at first light and said it the same way she said most things, directly, without preamble. 3 mares are out of the upper paddock, gates open. Vivian was off her stool and out of the barn before Naomi finished the sentence. The gate to the upper paddock was not just open. The latch had been forced, not broken, which would have been obvious, but bent in a specific way that someone with the right tool could do quietly, in a way that would look from a distance like a gate that had swung open on its own. The hinges were intact. The latch mechanism was damaged. It was deliberate. "When was last check?" Vivian said, already scanning the upper pasture. "Cal did the evening round at sundown," Naomi said, beside her. "Latch was secure then. He'd have noted it." "So sometime in the night," Vivian said. 3 mares out of 7. She ran through which 3 in her head based on who'd been where at evening. The gray mare, whose tendon was still in recovery, still not back to full soundness, still needing careful management. The Reardon mare, 3 weeks into a confirmed pregnancy, the first pregnancy that Vivian's adjusted breeding schedule had produced. And the young chestnut filly she'd been working on. Not pregnant, not injured, but part of the bloodline documentation she'd been building. She turned to Naomi. "Get Gideon and Cal, now." She was already moving toward the tack room for Willow's gear. What followed was 2 hours of hard riding in the cold morning, Vivian and Cal sweeping the north pasture while Gideon took the south, covering the ground in the systematic pattern that Cal knew from years of working the property. Willow moved well in the cold, responsive, and willing, and Vivian rode her hard over the rough ground and tried not to let her imagination run ahead of the facts. The gray mare was the first one found, standing in a juniper draw about a half-mile from the paddock, calm enough once she saw Willow approaching, but favoring her left hind, the same leg with the tendon issue. Not acutely lame, not dramatically worse than yesterday, but the added movement on uneven ground had set the healing back. How far back would take time to determine. Cal found the Reardon mare another mile out, near the creek that ran along the eastern property line. She was moving stiffly, possibly from the night cold and the unfamiliar ground. Vivian did a quick hands-on assessment when Cal brought her in. No obvious crisis, no immediate sign of a problem with the pregnancy. But stress was not nothing, and a pregnant mare who'd spent a cold night loose on rocky ground was a mare who needed watching. The chestnut filly took another 40 minutes to locate. Gideon found her finally in the northeast corner of the property where the fence met the ridge, standing with her nose pressed to the fence boards and trembling. She'd run herself hard before she stopped. Her legs were intact, no cuts, no obvious injury, but she was shaken in the way young horses got shaken when something they didn't understand happened to them in the dark. All 3 mares back by mid-morning. all three alive and on their feet. The damage was real but not catastrophic, and Vivian understood with the cold clarity of someone who'd been paying attention that not catastrophic was exactly what it was supposed to be. This was not a man trying to destroy Blackstone. This was a man reminding Blackstone of its vulnerability, reminding Vivian, specifically, that the things she cared for could be touched. She stood in the breeding barn beside the gray mare, running her hand down the tendon she'd spent 6 weeks nursing, and felt something move in her chest that was not fear and not grief, but was adjacent to both. The particular feeling of a person who has been told, in the clearest possible terms, that someone intends to keep hurting them. Gideon came into the barn and stood beside her. He looked at the gray mare's leg and at the careful way Vivian was holding her expression together. "Pruitt," he said. "Yes," she said. "I can't prove it." "No," she said. "Not yet." "Connolly needs to know," Gideon said. "Yes," she said. "And Fitch's report is due in 2 days. We need to push for it." Gideon was quiet for a moment. He put his hand on the gray mare's neck, above where Vivian's hand rested on the leg, and she was aware of the proximity in a way she hadn't been aware of proximity in a long time. She was also aware that she was too tired and too angry and too focused on the problem to do anything with that awareness except set it aside. "This is because of the sheriff," she said. "He found out we'd been there, and this was his response." "I think so," Gideon said, "which means Connolly was right. He's angry now, not calculating." She paused. "Angry enough to do something this visible, this," she searched for the word, "petty. This is not a man working a long game anymore. This is a man who wants to hurt something." "What do you want to do?" Gideon said. "Not what do we do, not what should be done. What do you want to do?" He was asking her specifically. She thought about it. She thought about her father, who had built something extraordinary and had it taken from him by the patient. Incremental work of people he hadn't fully understood were his enemies until it was too late. She thought about what it meant to rebuild something after watching it be destroyed, and about how different it was to protect something before it was destroyed, rather than try to reconstruct it afterward. "I want to go to the sheriff today," she said. "With you, with Cal, and I want to bring Naomi's statement about the paddock gate and the timeline, and I want every bit of it in Connolly's file before sundown." She paused. "And then I want to do something I've been thinking about since Carson City." Gideon looked at her. "What's that?" "The original debt records from my father's estate," she said. "The creditors that didn't make sense. You said the numbers were wrong. You said you'd investigated and couldn't prove anything." She met his eyes. "I want to look at those records myself, all of them, not just what the bank provided, the original loan agreements, the creditor filings, the timeline of the debt accumulation. Where would those be?" "My father kept records the way I keep records," she said. "Careful, complete, and in more than one place. The land office has the estate documents, but he also kept a private business ledger." She paused. "I didn't give it to the estate attorney because I didn't know what was in it, and I didn't want to hand anything to the bank that might give them leverage they didn't already have." Gideon was very still. "Where's the ledger?" "With a woman named Ruth Hale in Reno," Vivian said. "My father's bookkeeper. She's had it since he died. I asked her to hold it until I knew what I was dealing with." "And now you know what you're dealing with," Gideon said. "Now I know what I'm dealing with," she said. "And I'm not sure, but I think that whatever Pruitt did to my father's finances is connected to what he's trying to do to Blackstone. The same patience, the same method, working the angles, filing things in the wrong places, using men like Webb who are flexible about their duties. It's the same person operating the same way he always has." Gideon absorbed this. The gray mare shifted her weight, and Vivian steadied her automatically, a hand at her shoulder, without breaking the train of thought. "If you can show he did it to your father," Gideon said slowly, "then we can show he's not just a neighbor with a boundary dispute," Vivian said. "He's a pattern, and patterns, once they're documented, are very hard to argue away." Gideon looked at her for a long moment with that careful, assessing attention that she had come to understand was not distance, but its opposite. The way he looked at things he was taking entirely seriously. "Reno is 2 days' ride," he said. "I know," she said. "I'll take you," he said. She looked at him. "You don't have to." I know I don't have to," he said. "I want to." He paused. And before you tell me this is your problem and your father's ledger and your investigation, I'd ask you to consider that Pruitt has his hands on my property too, and finding a pattern that connects what he did to your father to what he's trying to do to Blackstone is very much my business. She held his gaze for a moment. All right, she said. But we go to Connolly first. Today. Today, he agreed. They went to Connolly that afternoon, all four of them, Gideon, Vivian, Cal, and Naomi, whose statement about the paddock gate was delivered in the same flat, precise tone Naomi used for everything, which made it more convincing than it would have been coming from someone who sounded upset. Connolly listened to all of it. He wrote down everything. He said he would begin formal surveillance of the Blackstone boundary, which was within his authority to do under the circumstances. He also said quietly, as they were leaving, the attorney who filed that inquiry at the land office, Hartwell, he withdrew the filing this morning. They all stopped. Webb contacted him, Connolly said. I don't know what Webb told him, but the filing was withdrawn, officially and in writing. He paused. Pruitt's legal angle on the water rights is gone. Fitch's report on the markers is due in 2 days. The open sheriff's investigation is in the public record. Another pause. He's losing ground, and he knows it. Which is why the paddock gate, Vivian said. Which is why the paddock gate, Connolly agreed. She thought about that on the drive back to Blackstone. Losing ground. It was the right phrase. Pruitt had built something, a scheme, a plan, a patient structure designed to pull Blackstone's water rights into his possession and silence any witness who might connect him to the Ashcroft foreclosure. And the structure was coming apart, piece by piece. Each piece she and Gideon had documented and filed and put in front of the right official. But a man losing ground was a man who still had ground left to lose. And Harlan Pruitt had not, in her assessment, run out of moves. He'd run out of legal moves, perhaps. He'd run out of the quiet, procedural moves he preferred. What he had left was something less calculated and more dangerous. He had presence. He had men who worked for him and did what he said. He had 15 years of influence in this territory and the willingness to use it in ways that didn't always leave a paper trail. She watched the landscape go past and thought about her father's ledger in Ruth Hale's keeping in Reno, and about the particular kind of patience required to build a case against a patient man, and about how much more clearly she could see the shape of what had happened to her father's ranch, now that she had spent 2 months watching Pruitt work his angles on Blackstone. It was the same hand, she was almost certain. The same deliberate, incremental pressure applied through paperwork and influence, and the careful manipulation of men who were flexible about their duties. Thomas Ashcroft had not had someone beside him who understood what was happening until it was too late. Vivian intended to understand it while there was still something left to protect. The night before the Reno trip, she sat in her room in the bunkhouse and wrote a letter to Ruth Hale, explaining who would be coming and why, asking Ruth to have the ledger ready. She sealed it and left it with the outgoing mail for the Morning Post rider, who would get it to Reno a day ahead of them. She was folding the second copy, the one she kept for herself, the one that went in her coat pocket with all the other documents she'd accumulated, when she heard a knock at the bunkhouse door. Not her room door, the outer door. She went and opened it. Naomi Mercer stood on the step in the dark with a lamp in her hand and a look on her face that was not her usual look. It was softer than usual, more uncertain, which on Naomi was as remarkable as a dramatic expression would have been on someone else. I wanted to say something, Naomi said. She didn't wait to be invited in, which was also Naomi. She stepped inside and set the lamp on the small table and folded her hands in front of her in the particular way she had when she was composing herself. When Gideon brought you back from that auction, I thought, she paused, choosing the words. I thought he'd made an impulsive decision, that he'd seen a pretty woman in trouble and done what men do when they see that. I know what you thought, Vivian said. I'm not finished, Naomi said. Not sharply, just precisely. I've watched you for 2 months. I've watched you work, and argue with Gideon when he's wrong, and refuse to back down from Pruitt's people, and sit in Connolly's office and lay out a legal case as well as any attorney I've seen. And I've watched my brother. She stopped again. This pause was different. He's not an easy man, she said. He doesn't make friends easily, and he doesn't let people close easily, and the last woman he tried to build something with left because she couldn't stand how much of himself he gave to this place. She looked at Vivian directly. I'm not telling you what to do with that. I'm just telling you that I see what I see. Vivian was quiet for a moment. What do you see? she said carefully. I see a man who's started explaining his decisions to someone, Naomi said. He hasn't done that in a long time. She picked up her lamp. That's all I wanted to say. She moved toward the door. Don't get yourself hurt in Reno. I'll try not to, Vivian said. Naomi nodded once and went out, and the door closed behind her, and Vivian stood in the small room with the lamp burning and the letter in her hand, and Naomi's words settling in the air around her like the last note of something that hadn't quite resolved. She put the letter in her pocket. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall for a few minutes, not thinking anything in particular, just letting the shape of things sit there without forcing them into order. She was not someone who made decisions about what she felt before she had enough information to make them properly. She applied to her interior life the same careful methodology she applied to a breeding program. You watched, you recorded, you let time do what time did, and you didn't commit until the evidence was sufficient. She didn't have sufficient evidence yet, about a number of things, but she was accumulating it. She turned down the lamp and went to sleep, because tomorrow was a long ride and she needed to be sharp when she got to Reno, and whatever else was unresolved could wait its turn. In the morning, she was up before the light, the way she always was. And Willow was waiting, and the road was waiting, and somewhere in Reno was a ledger that she believed held the beginning of an answer she'd been looking for since the day the lawyers arrived with their satchels and their careful, apologetic voices and started taking apart everything her father had spent his life building. She intended to find out what was in it. Ruth Hale lived in a narrow two-story house on the east side of Reno, 3 blocks from the river, in the kind of neighborhood that had been respectable 20 years ago and was still respectable enough if you didn't look too closely at the peeling paint on the window frames. She was a small woman in her late 60s with sharp brown eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and the particular composure of someone who had spent decades keeping other people's financial lives in order and had learned that the best way to do that job was to feel very little about what you found. She had the ledger on the table when Vivian and Gideon arrived. She'd received the letter, as Vivian had hoped, a full day ahead of them, and she'd done more than just locate the book. She'd gone through it herself, the way she apparently went through everything, systematically and without sentiment, and she had a separate sheet of notes waiting beside it when she opened the door. I expected you sooner, Ruth said to Vivian, not as a rebuke, as an observation. I needed to understand what I was looking for before I looked, Vivian said. Ruth considered this and nodded, as if it was a reasonable accounting method. She looked at Gideon with the measuring attention of a woman who'd seen many men come through her employer's door over the years and had opinions about most of them. Whatever she saw in Gideon, she kept to herself, but she let him in, which was its own verdict. They sat at the kitchen table and Ruth pushed the ledger toward Vivian and said, Page 41. That's where it starts to go wrong. Vivian opened to page 41. Her father's handwriting looked up at her from the page. Small, careful, precise, the handwriting of a man who thought before he wrote and meant every word he put down. She had not seen it in months. She had not prepared herself for how it would feel to see it now, and the feeling moved through her chest before she could stop it, sharp and brief, and she pressed it back down because there was work to do, and she could grieve properly later, when the work was done. Page 41 was dated 3 years before her father's death. It was a record of a loan, a significant one, larger than anything in the preceding pages, taken against the anticipated value of the next breeding season's full crop. The creditor listed was a financial institution Vivian had never heard of, the Nevada Territorial Lending Consortium. She had never heard of it because it did not exist. She looked at Ruth. This institution, she said, doesn't appear in any territorial business registry I could find, Ruth said. I checked before you arrived. It was incorporated in 1870, has no recorded officers, no recorded address, and no history of other transactions that I could locate. She paused. It does, however, have a registered agent. Who? Gideon said. Ruth looked at her notes. A man named Carvel, Martin Carvel, attorney at law, Carson City. Vivian and Gideon looked at each other. Carvel is Pruitt's personal attorney, Gideon said. Has been for 10 years. Ruth looked at him over her spectacles. Then I suspect, she said, with the measured understatement of a woman who dealt in facts, that this loan was not what it appeared to be. Vivian went through the rest of the ledger with the same care she gave to breeding records, page by page, entry by entry, building the picture from its components. What she found Over the course of 2 hours at Ruth Hale's kitchen table with Gideon beside her reading the same pages, was this. 3 years before her father died, a loan had been made against the Ashcroft operation through a fictitious institution controlled by Pruitt's attorney. The loan carried an interest rate that was slightly above the normal range, but not outrageously so, not enough to trigger immediate suspicion. It had been structured with a balloon payment due at the end of year 3, which was the year her father died. Her father had not known, Vivian believed, that the institution was fictitious. He was meticulous about his operations, but he was not, by temperament, a suspicious man. He trusted what looked legitimate until he had reason not to, and the paperwork had been made to look legitimate. What he might have found out, and what might have gotten him looking more closely, was visible in a notation on page 67, written in a slightly different ink than the surrounding entries, as if added later, in a smaller and slightly less controlled hand than his usual writing. The hand, Vivian thought, of a man who was writing quickly and carefully because he'd discovered something alarming. See confirmed. NTL Consortium. Carvel agent. HP connection. Check original deed conditions. North Range water. Do not proceed with next breeding contract until clarified. HP. Harlan Pruitt. Her father had found the connection. He had been in the process of clarifying it when he died, and his death had come at exactly the moment when the balloon payment on the fraudulent loan was due, and the bank had moved in so fast that there had been no time for anyone to ask the right questions about the sequence of events. Vivian set the ledger down on the table and sat back in her chair. The room was quiet except for the sound of the river 2 blocks away and the distant noise of the Reno street. Gideon was looking at the notation on page 67. His jaw was doing the thing it did. Ruth Hale was watching Vivian with the particular careful attention of a woman waiting to see how someone received difficult news. He knew, Vivian said. Her voice was even. She was working to keep it even. He'd figured it out. He was building the case. And then he died, Gideon said quietly. And then he died, she said. And the bank moved, and everything went to creditors, and nobody looked closely at whether the creditors were legitimate because nobody had reason to look. Until now, Ruth said. Vivian looked at the ledger, at her father's handwriting, at the notation he'd written in the smaller, urgent hand of a man who understood he was looking at something important and needed to record it before the moment passed. He had done everything right, in the end. He had kept the record. He had written it down. He just hadn't had time to act on it. She was going to act on it. I need copies of all of this, she said to Ruth. Every page with an entry related to the consortium, the notation on 67, the original loan agreement, if it's here. The loan agreement is in the back pocket of the ledger, Ruth said. I found it when I was reviewing. Vivian found it. 3 pages, formally drawn, signed by her father, and countersigned by Martin Carvel as agent for the Nevada Territorial Lending Consortium. Legitimate looking, detailed, completely fraudulent. She looked at Gideon. This goes to Connolly, she said. And not just Connolly. This is territory-level fraud. This needs the territorial attorney's office. I know a man there, Gideon said. Daniel Hurst. He's honest. How honest? Honest enough that Pruitt has never been able to get close to him, Gideon said, which in this territory is as honest as you get. Then we need to see him, she said, before we go back to Blackstone. Ruth made the copies herself, at her kitchen table, with the careful hand of a woman who had copied financial documents her whole professional life. She would not let Vivian help, which Vivian accepted because the copies needed to be accurate, and Ruth was faster than she was. While Ruth worked, Vivian wrote a summary of the evidence chain, the fraudulent loan, the consortium, Carvel's role, the notation in her father's hand, the connection to the estate foreclosure, and the pattern that connected it to Pruitt's attempted land grab against Blackstone. She wrote it the way she'd been taught to write everything, clearly, without embellishment, in the order that events occurred, with every date and name and document reference accounted for. When both of them were finished, Vivian looked at what they'd assembled on the table. There it was. Not everything, not a complete airtight case, not something that made the outcome certain, but a documented pattern in multiple hands across multiple years supported by official records, and a bookkeeper's testimony and a murdered man's private notation that pointed unambiguously in one direction. Ruth, she said, would you be willing to provide a sworn statement about the ledger, its provenance, how you came to hold it, what you found when you reviewed it. Ruth looked at her over the spectacles. I held that ledger because your father trusted me with it, she said. I'll say whatever is true about it in whatever room requires me to say it. Vivian looked at her for a moment. Thank you, she said, for holding on to it, for not giving it to the estate attorneys when the bank was pushing. Ruth made a small sound that wasn't quite dismissal. Your father told me once that the difference between a good bookkeeper and a great one was knowing which records were too important to be anyone else's problem. She closed her notebook. I took that seriously. Daniel Hurst kept an office on the second floor of a building 2 streets from the territorial court, and he received them the same afternoon without an appointment, which said something about either Gideon's standing in the territory or Hurst's genuine accessibility, and Vivian suspected it was some of both. He was younger than she'd expected, early 40s, lean and angular, with the sharp, mobile face of someone whose mind moved faster than his expression usually showed. He read the summary Vivian had written while they sat across his desk from him, and he read it the way she'd written it, in order, without jumping ahead. When he finished, he went back and read 2 sections again. Then he set it down. The notation in the ledger, he said, in Ashcroft's own hand. You have this documented. Ruth Hale's sworn statement and the original ledger, Vivian said, both available. And the consortium's registration. No registered officers, no address, Carvel as agent, Gideon said. All verifiable through the Territorial Business Registry. Hurst looked at the loan agreement copy. He looked at it for a long time. Carvel has been Pruitt's attorney for a decade, he said. It was not a question. Yes, Gideon said. And Pruitt has been attempting to acquire water rights from Blackstone Ranch through a land boundary claim, Hurst said, still not a question. A claim based on survey markers that were physically moved, Gideon said. Documented by licensed surveyor Harold Fitch. Formal report in Sheriff Connolly's file. Hurst sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, which Vivian had learned was the gesture of a man who was building something in his head rather than avoiding the conversation. What you have, he said finally, is not a complete criminal prosecution. Not yet. What you have is a documented pattern with legitimate evidentiary weight that justifies a formal territorial investigation. He paused. Which I can open. Today. Under territorial fraud statutes. Another pause. Once a formal investigation opens, Carvel cannot represent Pruitt in any matter related to the investigation without creating a conflict of interest that would disqualify him. Which leaves Pruitt without his primary legal instrument, Gideon said. His primary instrument for this particular scheme, Hurst said carefully. He looked at Vivian. I want to be honest with you. This takes time. Even with everything you've brought me, moving against a man like Pruitt in a territory where he has connections requires building a record that cannot be dismantled by those connections. It is not fast work. I've been patient before, Vivian said. Hurst held her gaze. Your father's estate, he said. The fraudulent loan. If the consortium is proven fictitious, and Carvel is proven to have acted as Pruitt's agent, the loan against your father's estate was fraudulent. A fraudulent loan cannot form a legitimate basis for the foreclosure action that followed. The room was very quiet. Meaning, she said, though she thought she knew. Meaning the foreclosure of the Ashcroft estate may have been illegal, Hurst said. Meaning there is a legal basis to pursue recovery. He paused again. Not recovery of everything. Assets have been sold, time has passed, and the law is imperfect. But potentially recovery of the estate's documented value against the parties who perpetrated the fraud. It is not a certain outcome, but it is a legitimate legal avenue. Vivian sat with that for a moment. The window behind Hurst showed the Reno skyline against the late afternoon sky, and somewhere out there the river ran the way it always ran, and she thought about her father in the last months of his life, writing that notation in a smaller hand than usual, trying to document what he'd found before time ran out on him. He had not had time to fight back. She had. Open the investigation, she said. Hurst opened it. They rode back to Blackstone the following morning, and the ride was different from the ride out in a way that was hard to put words to. The road was the same road. The weather was the same cold, dry November air. But Vivian sat on Willow with the copies of the ledger and the loan agreement and Hurst's preliminary investigation filing in her saddlebag, and the weight of them was a different kind of weight than the weight she'd been carrying since the bank took her father's ranch. That weight had been the weight of loss. This was the weight of something moving. She did not believe in certainty. She had watched certainty fail her father at the worst possible moment, and she had no interest in repeating that mistake. The investigation might take years. The recovery case was far from guaranteed. Pruitt had resources and connections and a territorial presence that would not crumble overnight simply because Daniel Hurst had opened a file. But the markers had been put back. She knew that because Connolly had sent a rider to Blackstone while they were in Reno. Naomi had sent word through Cal with the information that Pruitt's men had been spotted on the north boundary and that when Connolly's deputy went up to check, the survey markers were back in their original positions, exactly where Fitch had documented they should be. The move that Vivian had predicted, Pruitt finding out about the sheriff's investigation and sending men to undo the evidence. The evidence was already in Fitch's report. The evidence of the second tampering, the return of the markers, was now also on record, observed by Connolly's deputy. Pruitt had tried to clean up his mess and had only made it worse. When she and Gideon reached the Blackstone Ridge and the ranch came into view below them, Vivian pulled Willow to a stop for a moment and looked at it. The white fences, the barns sitting square, the long low house, the fence boards that still needed replacing, the corral gate that still hung 2 inches low, all the ordinary imperfection of a working place that cared more about what it did than how it looked. It had not become home the way she'd imagined home feeling, in the years when she'd had a home and hadn't thought much about what it meant. It had become something different, something she'd built a piece of herself into, in the way you built yourself into work you cared about. And the investment was visible now in the breeding barn she'd reorganized and the mares whose health she'd improved, and the stallion who came to her in 20 minutes instead of 40, and the gray mare whose tendon was slowly and imperfectly still healing. "You're looking at it like you're deciding something," Gideon said beside her. She glanced at him. "Maybe I am," she said. He didn't ask what. She appreciated that. They went down. The next 3 months were the months in which Harlan Pruitt's world contracted. It happened in the way that legal accountability usually happened. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in increments that were individually manageable and collectively inescapable. The territorial investigation created a paper record that Pruitt could not make disappear. Carvel removed himself from Pruitt's representation once his role as consortium agent became a formal matter of inquiry, citing the conflict Hurst had anticipated, and the attorney who replaced him was younger and less connected and considerably less skilled at the procedural maneuvers that had been Pruitt's primary method of operation. Webb at the county recorder's office retired from his position in January, citing health reasons, which was what men cited when they were stepping back from situations that had become more dangerous than profitable. His replacement had no history with Pruitt and no particular interest in developing one. Ellen Delaney, whatever she had known or suspected about Pruitt's schemes, made a point of bringing a pie to Blackstone in December and sitting at Naomi's kitchen table for an hour and leaving without having said anything directly substantive, but having conveyed through the territory's reliable currency of implication that the Delaney family's neighborhood loyalties were firmly with Blackstone and always had been. Naomi received this with the precisely calibrated graciousness of a woman who understood what was being offered and was willing to accept it on the terms offered, which was the right response, and kept the peace and let Ellen leave with her dignity, which cost Blackstone nothing and gained it something. Mira Delaney brought the 3-year-old gelding to Blackstone in early December, as she'd said she would, and Vivian spent 3 afternoons working with the horse while Mira watched and asked questions and took notes on a small pad she'd brought. And by the end of the 3rd afternoon, the horse was doing something he hadn't done in months, which was stand calmly in a new space with a new person handling him and not try to run from it. Mira cried a little, which she tried to hide, and didn't fully manage to hide, and Vivian pretended not to notice, which was the kind thing to do. She told Mira to come back whenever she needed. Mira said she would. She did. The gray mare's tendon healed. Not perfectly. There was a slight residual sensitivity in cold weather that Vivian suspected would always be there, a reminder of the night Pruitt's people opened the paddock gate. But she was sound, properly sound, and back in the breeding schedule, and in February she was confirmed pregnant. It was a small thing in the large accounting of what the winter had cost. Vivian kept careful track of the small things. The Reardon mare foaled in March. A filly, bay with a white star, strong from the first hour, with the temperament that Vivian's revised breeding decisions had been aiming for. Curious and calm, the best combination. Cal came and got Vivian when it happened, at 3 in the morning, and she came to the barn in her coat over her nightclothes and crouched in the stall and watched the filly figure out her legs, and the feeling she had watching it was not complicated. It was just good. The straightforward good of a living thing that wouldn't have existed without the work she'd done, whole and sound, and figuring out the world. Gideon appeared at the stall door at some point. She didn't know exactly when. She became aware of him the way she'd become aware of most things at Blackstone, as a presence that had become familiar enough that she noticed it when it was there and noticed the absence when it wasn't. "She's good," he said quietly. "She's better than good," Vivian said. "She's exactly what I was aiming for." He was quiet for a moment. The filly had found her feet and was pressing close to her mother, and the mare was doing what mares did, steady and practical about the whole enormous thing. "I need to tell you something," Gideon said. She looked up at him. "I told you at the auction that I knew your father," he said. "I told you about the horse and the price and what he said." He paused. "That was true, but it wasn't the whole reason I investigated the foreclosure." She waited. "I'd been watching Pruitt for 2 years before your father died," he said. "I'd seen him work the same angles on smaller operations to the north. Men who couldn't hold against the pressure, who sold out or walked away before anyone could document what was happening to them. I knew his method. I recognized it." He paused again. "When your father's foreclosure happened the way it did, I knew it wasn't what the bank said it was. I just couldn't get to the documentation fast enough, and by the time I had enough to bring to anyone, you were already gone from the ranch." Vivian was very still in the straw. "You went to the auction looking for me," she said. "I went to the auction because I knew you'd be there," he said. "Because I knew you had the last documented animal from your father's bloodline, and I knew Pruitt would be there for the same reason." He met her eyes. "I wasn't rescuing you. I want to be clear about that. I was trying to keep Pruitt from acquiring an asset that was part of a fraudulent estate, and I was trying to put someone who understood what her father had built in a position to fight for it." "You could have told me that at the auction," she said. "You wouldn't have believed me at the auction," he said. "You didn't know me. You had $9 and a horse and a man who just tried to take the horse from you, and the last thing you needed was a stranger with a complicated explanation." She thought about that. She thought about herself standing in the auction yard with Willow's lead rope clenched in both hands, trying to look like a woman who had choices. He was right. She wouldn't have believed him. She barely would have heard him. "So you paid $350 for a horse," she said. "I paid $350 for a horse," he said. "And I offered you work. And I waited for you to find the rest of it yourself." "You waited," she said. "You're not someone who needs things handed to her," he said. "I knew that the moment you didn't let go of the rope." She looked at him for a long moment in the dim barn light, with the filly moving behind her and the mare's steady breathing and the smell of new life around them. And she thought about all the things she'd cataloged about Gideon Mercer over the months she'd been at Blackstone. The decisions he made fast and the ones he held for a long time. The way he listened when she disagreed with him. The way he'd said, "What do you want to do?" instead of "What should we do?" The quiet, particular way he'd put his hand near hers on the gray mare's neck and not made anything of it. She thought about Naomi saying he started explaining his decisions to someone. She thought about her father, writing in his careful hand, building a record of what he'd found before time ran out. She thought about the ledger in Ruth Hale's keeping and the notation on page 67 and the fact that the most important things her father had left her were not the horses or the land or the bloodlines, but the methodology. The belief that if you documented everything and kept the record and stayed at the work, the truth would eventually have enough evidence behind it to stand on its own. "I'm not going to thank you for any of it," she said. "The bid, the job, the waiting." "I don't want to be thanked," he said. "Good," she said. "Because what I want is a partnership, formal, documented, equal share in the breeding program's decisions, and equal recognition in the operations record." She paused. "Not because of anything except that it's what I've earned." Gideon looked at her steadily. "I know what you've earned," he said. "I've known for a while." "Then we're agreed," she said. "We're agreed," he said. The filly made a small sound behind her, testing its voice in the way new foals did, and it was such an ordinary and extraordinary sound that Vivian almost laughed. And she didn't quite, but the almost was visible on her face, and Gideon saw it, and something in his expression did the thing it almost never did. It opened, just for a moment, just enough. She went back to watching the filly. He stayed in the doorway. Neither of them said anything else, because nothing else needed to be said right then, and they had both learned by now that the things that didn't need to be said were worth more than the things that were said before they were ready. In April, Daniel Hurst's investigation produced its first formal finding. The Nevada Territorial Lending Consortium was declared a fraudulent entity under territorial law, and Martin Carvel's registration as its agent was a matter of official record. The finding did not arrest anyone. It did not immediately recover anything. But it was on record, permanent and public, and it was the first domino in a sequence that Hurst told Vivian in a letter she received on a Tuesday morning while she was reviewing breeding notes would continue to fall. Pruitt did not attend the spring auction at Carson Bluff. This was noted by everyone who had always seen him there. On a Wednesday afternoon in late April, Vivian was in the round pen with the stallion, 20 minutes flat, now the way it had been for months, when she heard Willow call from the barn. Not an alarm call, not distress, just the particular low sound the mare made when Vivian had been out of her sight for longer than the mare considered reasonable. Vivian finished what she was doing with the stallion, latched the gate, and walked across the yard toward the barn. The Nevada afternoon light was doing what it did in late April, coming in at that long golden angle that made the fences and the barn boards and the ordinary working surfaces of a ranch look briefly like something more than themselves, the kind of light that made everything it touched seem worth keeping. She was thinking about the Reardon filly's first month of progress, and about the gray mare's confirmed pregnancy, and about the formal partnership agreement that she and Gideon had drawn up with an attorney from Carson City, a different attorney, a careful one, and signed in February with Naomi as witness, Naomi's signature written with the same precise and slightly reluctant hand she used for everything, which was somehow the most Naomi thing about the whole occasion. She was thinking about the letter from Hurst that said the sequence will continue, and about her father's ledger sitting now in Hurst's evidence file where it would do the most good, and about the copy of page 67 that she kept in her coat pocket, her father's handwriting pressed against her chest every day, which was something she had not told anyone and did not intend to. She was thinking about all of it and none of it, the way the mind moved when the urgent things had been handled, and what was left was the steady, ordinary forward motion of a life being built from what you had left after the worst had already happened. Gideon was leaning on the paddock fence when she came around the corner of the barn. He was looking at the upper pasture where the two youngest foals of the season were moving, testing themselves against the warm afternoon. He had a coffee cup in his hand and the relaxed posture of a man who had worked hard all day and earned this particular 10 minutes. He heard her footsteps and looked over. "Filly's moving well," he said. "She's moving beautifully," Vivian said. She came and stood beside him at the fence. "The bay colt is going to be something in 2 years." "Your Reed?" "My Reed," she confirmed. They stood and watched the foals in the light. The stallion was calling from the round pen, his voice carrying across the yard in the way voices carried on still afternoons in open country. She did not have everything she had lost. She was not going to pretend otherwise, even to herself, which was the thing she was most careful about, not pretending to herself. The Ashcroft ranch was gone in the legal sense, sold off in pieces to people who would never know what Thomas Ashcroft had built there or how long it had taken him to build it. The recovery case was moving slowly through Hurst's office, and might move slowly for years and might not recover what she'd imagined in the dark months after her father's death that she was owed. But the ledger was in evidence. The fraud was on record. The people who had done this to her father were operating in a much smaller space than they'd been operating in 6 months ago, and that space was shrinking in the documented, methodical way that her father would have recognized and approved of. And she was here, standing at a fence in April light with good horses in front of her, and a partnership that was real, and work that was hers, and a copy of her father's handwriting in her pocket. It was not everything. It was enough to keep working with. "I've been thinking," Gideon said, in the casual tone he used when he was not being casual. "About what?" she said. "About the fact that partnership agreements are one kind of arrangement," he said. He was still looking at the foals. "And there are other kinds." Vivian looked at him. He turned to meet her eyes, and he had the expression he had when he'd made a decision and wasn't going to unmake it, which she had come to recognize as one of his most fundamental qualities. The man committed slowly and completely and did not retreat from commitments once made. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I want to be clear about that up front. I'm not good at the talking part of it." "I know," she said. "Naomi says I'm impossible to live with," he said. "She's been saying it for 40 years, and she's not wrong." "I've noticed," Vivian said. "You're not easy either," he said. "You argue with everything, and you never ask for help, and you keep more inside than is probably healthy." "I know," she said again. "So," he said, "knowing all that." She looked at him for a long moment. The light was doing its April thing around them, and the foals were moving in the pasture, and somewhere Willow was calling again, impatient, the way she always was. "Ask me properly," Vivian said. He did. It was not eloquent. It was Gideon, direct and unadorned, the same way he made every decision, with the words he had rather than words borrowed from somewhere more polished. She would remember it exactly, every plain-spoken word of it, for the rest of her life. She said yes. She said it the same way she said most things, simply, without theater, because it was the true answer, and she didn't need to dress the truth up to make it worth saying. Naomi, when she was told, said, "Finally," and went back to whatever she'd been doing, which was as close to celebration as Naomi ever came and was, from her, a significant thing. Cal Braden shook Gideon's hand and nodded at Vivian with the brief, firm respect of a man who had started out skeptical and ended up at something else entirely, and that nod meant more to her than most speeches would have. Pete Dawes grinned like a young man who'd been hoping for exactly this outcome and hadn't known how to say so. Mira Delaney heard about it through the ordinary channels of Territory News and sent a note that was warm and genuine and said nothing about her mother, which was the right call. They married in June, at Blackstone, in the way of people who cared more about the thing they were doing than the ceremony around it. Small, practical, with the people who mattered there, and the people who didn't matter notably absent. The day was hot, and the food was good, and Willow was in the paddock closest to the yard and spent the whole afternoon watching the proceedings with her ears forward and her dark eyes moving from Vivian to the guests and back, the way she always tracked Vivian, with the steady, particular attention of an animal who had been through everything alongside her person and was not planning to stop now. At some point in the evening, Vivian slipped away from the gathering for a few minutes and stood at the paddock fence with Willow's nose against her shoulder and her hand on the mare's neck, and she thought about the auction yard at Carson Bluff, and the $9 in her pocket, and the feel of the lead rope in both hands when Harlan Pruitt had tried to take it. And she thought about her father writing in his careful hand, building his record, leaving her the most important thing he had, which was the knowledge of how to hold on. She thought about the woman who had sat alone in that yard, which was herself, and also somehow a person she could now see from a slight distance, the way you could see yourself clearly once the worst of a season had passed, and you were standing in a different place looking back. That woman had not been weak. She had not been a person waiting to be rescued. She had been a person in the middle of the hardest year of her life, who had not let go of the rope when someone tried to take it, and everything that had come after had come from that one decision, made in a moment of pure stubbornness and fear, to hold on. Her father had said once that the horses who mattered were the ones who didn't break in the hard seasons. Not the ones who never faced a hard season. Those horses were just lucky. The ones who mattered were the ones who came through it still themselves, a little rougher, a little wiser, still standing. She had thought about that a great deal over the winter. She thought it was probably true of people too. The ones who mattered were the ones who came through still themselves, not unchanged, because nothing came through unchanged, but recognizable, still holding what they'd held. Gideon found her at the fence after a few minutes. He didn't ask what she was thinking about. He just came and stood beside her, which was enough, which was actually exactly right. The evening light was doing the long summer thing, staying gold far later than it should, and the horses moved in the pasture below, and the sounds of the gathering carried from the yard, and Blackstone was alive around them with the ordinary, irreplaceable sounds of a working place at the end of a good day. She was not finished with Pruitt's accounting. That was still ahead, still moving through Hearst's office, still accumulating its patient documentation. Justice in her experience was not a thing that arrived. It was a thing you built, the same way you built a breeding program, or a legal case, or a life after the worst had happened. One careful piece at a time, on the record, with the evidence solid beneath you. She intended to keep building it. But right now, in this moment, in this particular June light, With her husband beside her and her horse warm under her hand, and the knowledge of her father's careful handwriting pressed against her heart, she let herself be exactly where she was. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole of what she had, and she had learned, in the hardest possible school, that the whole of what you have is the only thing worth building from. She kept her hand on Willow's neck. She kept her eyes on what was ahead.